Good morning. Good morning, everyone. And welcome to the St. Petersburg College Seminole campus. And this, the third in a series of forums stemming from the oil crisis in the Gulf. This series has benefited from the support of many fine sponsors: the Tradewinds Resort, the St. Petersburg Times, Bay News 9 and the Bright House Networks, the Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association, Progress Energy, and the Florida Business Network for a Clean Energy Economy, and is brought to you under the auspices of St. Petersburg College's, I continue to trip over the terminology, Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions. That's the working title for a major new policy institute that's currently under study by the college's Board of Trustees and was referenced by President Law at the very first forum in this series. How many of you have been to all three of these forums? How many of you have been to three? Yeah, we have several of you have been to all three forums. And for how many of you is this the very first forum you've attended? Quite a few first-timers. We're very pleased to see many students in the audience today because they were off during the first two forums on the summer break for those first two events, and we're glad to have students in the audience today. To bring those of you who weren't at all three forums up to date, the first forum occurred in July while oil was gushing in the Gulf from the Deepwater Horizon well. And the title and focus of that forum was Impact: what was happening, what was being done, and what could we do as the threat continued. The second forum was in August, and it occurred just as the well had been capped, and the attention turned to, and the forum was appropriately titled and focused on, Next Steps: what was still unknown, what we'd learned from best practices in the Gulf cleanup, and what might Pinellas do to prevent or address a similar crisis. And that brings us to today. Now that the oil spill is not front-page news, what are our longer-term policy options and energy alternatives? What is the future of energy, and how do we begin a meaningful dialogue culminating in action so we aren't facing this type of crisis again? And the focus and the title of today's forum is Finding Pathways to Policy on the Future of Energy. Again, this time we have an all-star panel to address these questions, but first some announcements and logistics. If you have a cell phone, please set it on vibrate or turn it off. The restrooms are to your left and right, men and women. Men and women, yes. We're having a little bit of a different format if you've been to the previous two forums based on the feedback we received. The panel members are going to speak individually, and then there's going to be discussion among the panel members on some of the issues that were raised that really focus on those key issues. And then there'll be questions from the audience. You should have in your program a copy of a comment card or a question card that you can complete, and we'll have a time for you to pass those forward, because after the discussion by the panelists, there'll be a discussion of questions brought from the audience. If you are viewing this as a streamed presentation online, you can send your questions to me. I'll be in the front of the room on the laptop at se_info@spcollege.edu. We also, as I mentioned, will stream this live, and we will archive it, and it will be on YouTube a few days following the event if you have friends who are not able to view it live or online. Okay, it's not in the program, but we're going to begin this morning with a short 6-minute film from the Florida Solar Energy Center at the University of Central Florida that provides a great overview on energy alternatives and costs.
Most people agree that we should stop burning imported fossil fuels for energy. What people tend to disagree on is the cost of implementing renewable energy. Some feel that the best strategy for Florida is to do nothing because the initial cost of renewable energy seems too high. But in fact, renewable energy actually costs less over the long term compared to doing nothing. The initial cost of renewables needs to be seen as an investment, just as sending a student to college is an investment. the long-term benefits far outweigh the upfront costs. So, how do we get there? The first step to a sustainable energy future is to increase the energy efficiency of our homes. By reducing the amount of energy we use in our homes, we can reduce our energy costs and have more money for the things we enjoy. Energy retrofits are an excellent example of investing for the future. These improvements pay for themselves over time, and as the cost of electricity increases, so do the savings from the retrofits. For example, by 2020, energy retrofits can save an estimated 56% per month off of our electricity bill. To achieve this level of savings, starting from the most cost-effective, we should install a programmable thermostat. Next, fix leaky ducts, install compact fluorescent lighting, insulate hot water storage tanks, upgrade ceiling insulation, use an Energy Star refrigerator, install a solar water heater, and use a more energy-efficient air conditioner. For example, homeowner A retrofits his house, while homeowner B chooses to do nothing. If we tally up their mortgage and electricity costs over the next 10 years, we find that homeowner A actually has paid less than homeowner B. Not only has homeowner A spent less money, he has also increased the value of his home, emitted less greenhouse gases, employed local workers, and stimulated the local economy. Let's take a look at the numbers. Using the previous example, if 3% of the homes in Florida are retrofitted each year, by 2020, each home will save $1,536 per year. A total of $285 million in energy cost savings for the 186,000 retrofitted homes, and a savings of 1.05 million tons of CO2. Each year, we will generate $3.8 billion in new economic activity, 42,000 direct jobs, and 15,000 indirect jobs. The next step to sustainability is renewable power generation. Currently, we import all of our fossil fuels that are used to generate electricity. This results in $15 billion being shipped out of state each year. If we could instead use one of Florida's natural resources to produce electricity, it would put that $15 billion back into Florida's economy. Why not use the energy source that is renewable, clean, and has no fuel costs? Sunshine. Of course, this is when the argument comes up that solar electric panels are too expensive. Currently, electricity from photovoltaics or PV panels is more expensive than electricity obtained from burning imported fossil fuels. But in a few short years, something very interesting is going to happen. It's called grid parity. Grid parity is simply the point in time when the falling costs of PV equals the rising cost of conventional electricity. From that point on, PV becomes the electricity producer of choice, and the idea of burning fossil fuels for electricity just doesn't make economic sense. The large debate focuses on when grid parity will be reached. Estimates range from 2 years to 10 years. But grid parity is inevitable. That's great, you may think. Let's wait until we reach grid parity and then buy PV when it's less expensive. The only problem with that idea is that PV manufacturers are currently looking for locations to build their manufacturing plants. Naturally, they are picking states that have a large demand for their products. If Florida doesn't create a market demand for PV before grid parity is reached, we will only be trading our imported fossil fuels for imported PV panels. We will miss out on billions in revenue and economic activity occurring from new jobs and the opportunity to export Florida-made PV panels around the world. By investing in solar energy now, we bring new manufacturers to Florida, creating economic benefits that far outweigh the initial investment. When you stop focusing only on the initial cost and focus on the long-term energy and economic security, it's plain to see that renewable energy in Florida ultimately costs far less than doing nothing.
With that overview, it's now time to begin our program, and it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Dan Berard, geophysical engineer and energy analyst with a long and distinguished career that you can read about in your program. He will introduce our panel and get the discussion going. Mr. Berard.
Thank you, Dr. Oliver, and thank you all for coming today. We have 4 distinguished people on our panel today that I'd like to introduce. The first person would be Dr. Daniel Lashof, who is currently Climate Center Director for the National Resources Defense Council. He works as a senior scientist specializing in national energy policy, climate science, and solutions to global warming. Our second panelist would be Dr. David Kartis, who is Director of Institute for Energy Systems, Economics, and Sustainability, as well as the Associate Director of the Center for Advanced Power Systems, both at Florida State University. The third panelist would be Barry Moline, who's Executive Director of Florida's Municipal Electric Association. Barry is Executive Director of this organization, where he served since 1996. He represents Florida's 34 publicly owned electric utilities before the legislature and regulatory agencies. Dr. Dale Brill is President of the Florida Chamber of Commerce Foundation and former State Director of Office of Tourism, Trade, and Economic Development. This is the research and policy development arm of the Florida Chamber of Commerce. Our first speaker will be Dr. Daniel Lashof. Dan?
Thank you. Well, thanks very much. Thank you all for coming and spending this morning listening to us talk about policy on a gorgeous morning out there. But I guess you're all from Florida, so you're used to that. I'm from Washington, and it's a pleasure to be here today. A Chinese proverb states that if you don't change directions, you're likely to end up where you're headed. And when it comes to energy, where we're headed is not good. It's not sustainable, it's not secure, and it's not affordable. The film we just had gives a good introduction of different directions that we can go in, and that's the good news. We know we're headed for a cliff on energy. We may not know exactly where it is, but we do know that there are alternative pathways that we can take that can avoid those problems and that are cleaner, safer, and cheaper. And the question that we face is whether we'll choose to change directions in time. Other panelists will focus on ways to begin steering a new course, and I'll be happy to join that discussion when we get into that period. But in my opening remarks, I'm going to focus on why we need to change directions. And let me summarize that with 3 words: pollution, insecurity, and unemployment. And those are 3 things we can avoid by taking a new direction in energy. So let me start with pollution. Our current energy system for producing and consuming energy has helped propel great prosperity in our country and around the world, but it also continues to be the largest source of pollution that now threatens to undermine that prosperity. This year we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Clean Air Act and the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency. We have made remarkable progress during those 40 years in reducing pollution. Rivers no longer catch on fire. Cars no longer pump out visible smoke as they go down the road. Factories no longer routinely foul the air with emissions that we can see, smell, and taste. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been saved as a result of the Clean Air Act, and billions of dollars of net benefits have been created. Yet we still have a long way to go. We set out goals 40 years ago for clean air, clean water, and we haven't reached them yet. Mountaintops are still being blasted away to reach the coal underneath. Oil rigs still dot our coastline and occasionally blow up, as we saw this summer, with tragic results. And most of all, carbon pollution continues to spew into our atmosphere unabated. It's 700,000 tons per hour, 16 million tons per day, and 6 billion tons per year. That heat-trapping pollution continues to build up in our atmosphere, and make no mistake, it is disrupting our climate. Climate change is no longer merely a matter of scientific projections. It's a matter of consequences that we are seeing all around us. Just this past summer, we saw devastating floods in Nashville, in Pakistan, in China, and we saw heat waves and wildfires in Russia. On Monday, it was 113 degrees in Los Angeles, and then the thermometer broke, so it may have gone higher. Now, here in Florida, the summer of 2010 was the hottest ever at 9 of the 22 weather stations that NOAA tracks for long-term climate monitoring. And it wasn't just hot during the day. It didn't cool down much at night either. In this area, for example, the nighttime low temperature averaged over June, July, and August was 76 degrees. That means that even at night, people aren't getting relief from the heat stress that builds up during the day, which is a particular problem for the elderly who are physiologically less capable of regulating their body temperatures, and for low-income individuals who don't have access to air conditioning. Now, one bad summer does not prove global warming. However, this summer's heat is part of a long-term trend that does prove global warming, according to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and other scientific bodies. The first 8 months of 2010 globally was the hottest such period on record, according to NASA data. That follows the hottest decade on record, which was 2000 through 2009. And as this chart shows, that decade supplanted the 1990s, which was the previous hottest decade on record, which itself replaced the 1980s, which was the hottest decade on record at that time. And Florida, of course, is ground zero for many other effects from global climate disruption. Increased stress on water supplies, coral bleaching from high sea surface temperatures and ocean acidification, sea level rise, and more intense hurricanes. Now, managing any one of these effects of global warming would be a significant challenge. But if not mitigated, the combination of all of them is likely to be unmanageable. Now, the heat-trapping pollution that's primarily responsible for global warming comes from two main sources: burning coal in power plants and burning oil, mostly in cars and trucks. As oil becomes more scarce, the quest for oil to keep our transportation system moving has forced us to seek oil from increasingly remote places. The easy-to-reach oil has simply been used up. So we end up going further and further afield. And whether those are platforms in the ultra-deep water of the Gulf of Mexico or imports from ultra-authoritarian regimes in the Gulf of Arabia, we know that depending on these sources is risky. It's risky for our environment, it's risky for our economy, and it's risky for our national security. I don't need to dwell on the environmental risks. You all are very familiar with those, and you've explored them in depth at previous sessions, which many of you have attended. But I do want to just provide a plug for my boss's book, which was just released, so I have a job when I get back to Washington. This book by Peter Lehner and Bob Deans is the first book published on the Deepwater Horizon blowout. In Deep Water takes a comprehensive look at the causes, the consequences, and the steps that we can take to minimize the chances that an accident like the Deepwater Horizon blowout ever happens again. Now let's be clear about one thing. The well has been plugged, but the aftermath of the spill is anything but over. Tar balls continue to wash up on shore in the Gulf of Mexico. We're finding layers of oil beneath layers of sand. And we simply don't know how much oil is left in the Gulf. What we do know is, at best, it's going to be many, many years for recovery. There has been some good news on this spill. In the last week, a report by Navy Secretary Ray Mabus released on Tuesday lays out a solid long-term plan for restoration of the Gulf. And Lisa Jackson, the head of EPA and a Louisiana native, has been put in charge of an interagency task force that will oversee implementation of that plan. Also this week, Interior Secretary Ken Salazar issued new safety rules for offshore drilling that look pretty strong to us on a first reading. There's ongoing work on the Gulf. NRDC's President Francis Beinecke is part of a commission appointed by the President, which is continuing to study what caused the accident and plans to make recommendations. They'll report in January. So while the first book on Deepwater Horizon has been published, the full story certainly hasn't been written. Meanwhile, the economic and security costs of our oil dependence continue to mount. We spend almost $1 billion every day on imported oil. That's $1 billion per day that we are not spending on high-speed rail in the United States. That's $1 billion per day that we are not spending building solar power arrays in the United States. And that's $1 billion a day that we're not spending to deploy electric vehicles. And it's $1 billion a day, a significant amount of which ends up funding authoritarian regimes around the world who are hostile to our interests. As Tom Friedman has said, we are funding both sides of the war on terrorism. And our demand for oil even increases the revenues to regimes that we don't buy oil from, because our high demand props up the world oil price. One estimate is that by pursuing a clean energy path in conjunction with our allies, we could lower the price of oil enough to reduce oil revenues to Iran by $100 million a day. Now, some elected officials who recognize that the environmental and the security benefits of clean energy have cited our weak economy as a reason why we shouldn't be acting now. We should wait to take action to move in a different direction. In my view, the opposite is the case. Power companies and manufacturers are sitting on billions of dollars in cash because uncertainty about the direction of our energy policy makes it impossible for them to decide what is a sound investment to make right now. In fact, Lou Hay, the CEO of Next Era Energy, based in Juno Beach, Florida, said that with the right policy framework, his company alone would invest $2.5 billion a year in wind and solar, creating 40,000 jobs per year over the next 5 years. That story would be repeated at countless companies around the country, and a study by the University of California projects that a clean energy path would create 1.9 million additional net jobs by 2020. Businesses across the country recognize the potential for a clean energy economy. More than 5,000 have joined American Businesses for Clean Energy to call on Congress to pass clean energy and climate legislation that will significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Unions also recognize the need for clean energy investments to create well-paying jobs in the United States. 9 major unions have joined with NRDC and the Sierra Club in the Blue-Green Alliance, which brings together nearly 9 million members and supporters in pursuit of good jobs, a clean environment, and a green economy. Both American Businesses for Clean Energy and the Blue-Green Alliance realize that the rest of the world will not stand still while the United States gets its act together. Last year, For the first time, China built more wind farms than the United States. Overall, China invested $35 billion in clean energy last year compared to $19 billion in the United States. China is racing to capture as much of the $13 trillion market for clean energy as they can. So the choice we face comes down to this. Will the United States stay on its current course and try to muddle through pollution, insecurity, and unemployment that entails? Or will we steer a new course to a clean energy future that cuts pollution, increases our security, and creates jobs? I hope we choose wisely, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lashof. Our next speaker would be Dr. David Kartis from Florida State University, Tallahassee.
Thank you. I got to admit, I'm at somewhat of an advantage. Normally I speak, I have a whiteboard and my audience is asleep. I have neither right now. And I'd also like to thank Dan because he took half my presentation away, so I don't need to lead with the preamble to try and scare everybody into paying attention. But it's true. We are facing a crisis in this country because we have an economy which is going on a downward spiral. And I truly believe that you have to have a strong, advancing energy economy for the rest of the economy to go along. And that's just historically proven. If you look in developing countries, they do not have a developing energy economy. If you look at when we advanced the best, it's when we were investing in our national grid. Okay, so we have to get a handle on the right investments, and it's a difficult problem. And we like to beat on America, but in truth, America has come farther than I would think any other country. If we think about it, yeah, China is building more capacity in wind, but we actually have a huge amount of capacity in wind right now in this country. And our wind capacity factor is probably 10% higher than most other countries, with the exception of the low countries in Northern Europe. It's around 32% right now. We invest in wind where it makes sense. So we do a good job in this country. We're Americans, damn it. We do a good job. We need to keep doing a good job. Here's what happens. In 1970s, we had an energy crisis in this country. We did have a Clean Air Act. We had our first Energy Security Acts. We were doubling. From 1960 to mid-70s, we doubled our energy consumption in this country with very little increase in our population. From the mid-70s to now, that's 30-some years, we've only doubled our energy consumption again. But our population has nearly doubled. Let's pat ourselves on the back. Okay? But that's the beginning of the story. And I think Dan did a very good job of highlighting how difficult it's going to be to move forward. We've got to get behind this and start pushing. Next slide, please. Oh, where is it at? Oh, right here? Oh, sorry. I tell you, without my whiteboard, I'm lost. All right, so today it's going to be more of a small workshop rather than an enlightening presentation. So if you want to go to sleep, I'm used to it. It's fine. But again, I'm going to introduce you about my institute very quickly so that you can see there's a lot of alignment with what's going on in the state and what's getting ready to happen down here at St. Pete. I'll give you some background on energy policy necessity, talk about some thoughts on policy goal setting, and then I'll give you a really quick example on some smart grid research that's going on in policy research, and hopefully that'll give you some really good idea how difficult the problem is. All right, I direct an institute which is doing just what St. Pete wants to do, to look at policy, particularly in the area of environment and global climate change and energy. We like to think of our brand as informed governance, economics, and decision making. We have ready-to-use technologies already on the shelf. We have warehouses of patents out there in energy. What we don't have is a sound policy that creates market pull to get them into the market. That's the real need in this country. This is our problem. We're looking forward and we have a ton of hurdles. Our energy policy right now looks even worse than this row of hurdles must look to this runner. Okay? So the challenge is We want to achieve economic development and we want to do it through a green tech sector. Why? I firmly believe the green tech sector is going to create a lot of jobs for the state of Florida. We have to get our people moving back to the state. My grandchildren have to live in Florida and be able to have a good, solid income. And that's not going to happen unless we create jobs in the state. Okay, Florida needs to become an international hub, both in Latin America and in Asia. It's those partnerships. We need to shift from a European model of partnerships to where the developing countries are. That's always been our strength. We got strong by building Europe after the war. Now let's get strong by building the third world. Okay? Investments in low carbon energy sources has to come in Florida. We do not have a large resource in renewable energy in this state. All right, we have to really get smart about how we engage and exploit those opportunities so that we get the best return on our investments. All right, and we need to start thinking with a market pull approach rather than a technology push approach. Technology push is just too expensive for our state. This is where Dan saved me a lot of time. I'm not going to go over the entire history of the energy stuff. I think Dan did a very good job of it. It's in the presentation. I think it's going to be online. You can look at it. But we have gone through some trials and tribulations over the last 30 years in energy, starting with the energy crisis in the mid-'70s with OPEC, going all the way through the Gulf oil spill, which we are still struggling with today. Okay, it's a long experience with lots of experience. We need to get all those experienced people to sit down at the table and work on solutions. Solutions to energy are political. I had a journalist from Jacksonville call me one time, and she wanted me to say that the problem with our energy policy is politics. Well, it's not, folks. The problem with our energy policy is politics isn't working. The solution has to be political. Okay. Here's the nature of our problem. Right now, we can't build a plant in this state. We can rebuild some plants, but we've not been able to get, with the exception of, I think Tallahassee has done some very good rebuilding and some other places where we've got a few plants in, but not on our targeted growth, which has showed up in any of our 10-year growth plans for the last few years, okay? Our load has, until just recently, has been continuing to grow. And this is not a state phenomenon, this is national. All right, so right now, what you see here from the Peabody Energy Institute is just showing what our percent capacity growth is going to be and our load growth is going to be. Our capacity is growing nationwide at about 6%, and our load growth is growing at about 19%. That means by around 2025, folks, we're going to be in the same place that India is today, same place China was before they started investing, and the same place my wife's country, the Philippines, is today. Rolling blackouts. Our apartment in Angeles City, Saturday is my day without power. You ever lived in a country that has 100-degree temperatures and you know every Saturday you're not going to have an air conditioner? Okay, it's bad. That's where we're headed. We've got to get a handle on it. Here's the tension, and I think as we move to a third world energy economy in this state and around across the country, here's what you see in the Philippines, and I've done a lot of studying on the energy economy in the Philippines. You've got USAID. We're investing heavily to the tune of $8 to $10 million a year just in the Philippines on our energy economy. Alan Eisenrath, who's a senior financial analyst, says that the Philippine economy, of all the developing countries they look at, is probably the nearest one to reach a first world type grid with a tradable market and investment and things like that. But when I travel around and talk to the mayors and the provincial governors, they don't care about energy. They care about making money on the credit market when Kyoto 2 comes around, okay? Now, both are important. We do need to trade in carbon, all right? We need to get carbon down, so there needs to be some kind of carbon price. That's important. But we also need a tradable market as well. Policy solves that tension, okay? A confused policy will make a mess of that tension. So we have a train wreck occurring. Right now we have utility rates going up astronomically in some places, and in some places we have a lot of lack of investment and rates are not going up. The story of this slide really is if we're going to get the investments we need, rates have to go up. Somebody has to tell the people of the state and the country it's expensive, all right? It's not going to be cheap. You know, and where my mother lives, her bill for electricity was $275 20 years ago. Her bill for electricity today is $300 in the summertime. It hasn't gone up a whole lot, but she complains and she votes, and that's the problem with energy in this country. Okay, All right, so how do we create policy? It's really kind of like making a meal. There's a menu. We've been studying how to make policy for a long time in democracies, and it's really a 1, 2, 3, process. The first thing we have to do is determine what our goals are, and this is where the politics comes in. This is where the back rooms and cigars and the martinis really shape our policy, okay? They've got to get in there and they've got to figure out what stretch goals we can all agree on, all right? As a group, left, right, center, up, down, I don't care where you come from, all right? Then once we figure out what those are, we need to figure out what the measurable objectives are. So many of our policies actually can't be measured. We throw money into them, we don't even know if it works. We've got to figure out how to measure what our vision is and make sure we're moving forward. And then step 3 is, once we know how to measure it, we got to know what our tools are, okay? We need to know whether we are going to do this through public agencies like Department of Environmental Protection, or we're going to do this through civic agencies like NGOs, through PACs or some other civic organization. Where are we going to target the policy? What tools are we going to use? I can tell you in this state for the last few years we've been using incentives and it hasn't helped us a whole lot, all right? We put an incentive in the policy and then the appropriation committee comes and puts no incentive in the incentive policy. It doesn't work, all right? So you got to get the appropriation to match the policy. Timeline, is it going to be aggressive or wait and see? Some things are highly speculative and really should be wait and see with a lot of measurement and oversight. Some things are pretty certain and they need to be fairly aggressive. But that needs to come based on our vision and our stretch goals. And then do we do this through buy-in? Do we get public to actually go out and just be more conservative, or we demand that we have automated conservation demand-side management where we just start turning people's stuff off for them because we don't think that they're able to do it themselves, okay? But that's how you go about making a policy. I put down a list of stretch goals I think that really impact the state of Florida here. We need to have a new way of investing in technologies. For the past few years, we've been investing in technology push. And that means we put a lot of money into the hype and hope that something pops out the other side, rather than going in and looking where the gaps are in our energy economy and putting a little bit sparingly putting money into filling those gaps with technology or bringing the companies that provide those services to the state. I think we really need to look at market pull approaches in this state. We've got to get our investment done right. One of the things that's bothered me for a few years watching our legislative bodies is, especially with solar, we get a lot of banks like Barclays coming in saying we should do solar in this state. See, Barclays isn't registered in the state, okay? I'll be happy when I see Wakulla Bank going out and asking for a new incentive for solar. That way I know we've gotten it right. When our own banks in this state start looking at investing and our own small businesses are applying for that money. And that gets us to the next one down is capital flight. We have too much money leaving this state from our energy policies, lack of policies, if you will. We need to figure out how to keep capital in the state. We've got to get a handle on purchase power. We like to think we have clean power. We've invested a lot of money in gas plants, but we don't buy our gas. We buy the cheap stuff from West Virginia, and it's made with coal. All right? Purchase power sends money out and brings carbon in. But on two fronts, purchase power is bad for the state of Florida. Regulator uncertainty, again, as Dan was saying, the utilities do have money. They still need to make profit. They don't get much return on equity. And I stress equity, they don't get return on investment. We have to figure out how to make the market more certain for them. They have to make money. As I said at the very beginning, a progressive economy has a progressive energy economy. We got to get market development, workforce reliability, energy security, and we need to get a handle on nuclear versus renewable in this state. C.E. Hobbs, who's a senior fellow at PERC, he had a couple of slides last week at the Florida Energy System Consortium, and I just wanted to steal a couple of the slides and put them in mine here. In order of magnitude, what the smart grid investment does, he says, it yields great benefits to utilities, consumers, energy security, and energy independence. The problem is those things don't always line up. We got to get people back into the back rooms with their martinis and their cigars, figuring out how to get these things to line up in this state. Is it generation, transmission, or distribution? And I think you have to invest in all of them at the same time. You have to have a cohesive policy. You can't just cherry pick. Does energy efficiency come first or after? Boy, I think it comes first. Even though we've made great strides in energy efficiency, there are still great things that can come from there. Is demand management is it going to work for us? Well, demand-side management works great. People put on nice suits and sit in a room and tell you, yeah, we want to do that. But for the most part, the independent-owned utilities don't make money on demand-side management, okay? And their investments in that really yield very little equity. So we have to figure out how can we get somebody to make money on demand-side management in this state. We don't really allow independent wholesale power producers into this place. Nobody can come in and aggregate the demand so that we can dispatch load reduction. So we have a lot of things we've got to deal with there. The one on the bottom is hugely important. How do we change the behavior of consumers? Can we do it through automation, or do we have to do it through education and outreach? We don't do a very good job of science education in this state. We just don't. And that should be a primary part of our energy policy. This is a quick slide I told you would probably put most of you to sleep. This is a top-level overview of where we're at with looking at smart grid in this state. And there's people like me who've been working in smart grid for 10 or 15 years, and we've tried working with a technology push point of view and seeing nothing happen. And we've come to the conclusion that if smart grid's going to work, utilities have to make money on smart grid. Okay, it's not going to happen if they don't. Then we've looked at using that new basic premise, where should the investments be? And the primary investment we need to make in this state is in assets and asset management. What are the profit markets out there for smart grid and alternative energy? Where are they? And then from that, look at investing in smart distribution and transmission infrastructure. We've got to get a handle on interoperability. We have so many players right now, and their intelligence, really, their connectivity can't talk to each other. We've got to figure out how to get interoperability done. And we need workforce, all right? The workforce in this state, again, using the comment I said about math and science education, we have to bring people in. TurboCore moved to Tallahassee, brought in half their workforce from Canada, rather than hiring their people from Tallahassee. We've got to stop that model of economic growth in the state. Conclusions, we can't blame our regulators. I hear people wanting to blame the PSC all the time. The PSC just implements policy. It comes from our legislature, and then it's signed by our governor. That's where we get policy in this state. It doesn't come from the PSC. We've got to quit beating up on our regulators. To date, there is no central clearinghouse to collect and evaluate intelligence. And as a researcher, this is the biggest one for me. We need centralized data. And you're going to hear from Barry Moline here in a second. The great thing about the state of Florida is we have very vibrant municipal electrics. There is a source of data out there which is open to us. We've got to get better at getting relationships between the state and the municipals so that they help us come up with the solutions, because they're under a different profit model. There's not a profit model than the utilities. This is really an asset that we have in the state that we have to get better at utilizing. We need institutions that empower the dream. And we need a smart grid strategy coordinated such that the benefits of smart grid deployment are realized, not just petered away. And the bottom one actually is the biggest one I got from Hobbs. It took us 100 years to get our grid to where it is today. We've actually got a couple years to get our legislators and our governor to get in that back room, break out their martinis and cigars, and give us a policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kartas. Are we going to be serving martinis after Dr. Alden? Our next speaker is Barry Moline, who is Executive Director of the Florida Municipal Electric Association. Barry?
Thanks. So I'm from the electric utility industry, and I'll tell you where I am, or how I represent the utility industry in a minute. But I want you to know that it's okay to take shots at me, at least metaphorically, take shots. If you have something that you want to get off your chest, I promise you in the Q&A, afterwards, whatever, go for it, okay? Metaphorically. Today I'm going to talk about some of the background of where we are energy-wise. I'm going to give you some background about who I am, a little bit personally about who I am, as well as where who I represent. We'll talk about some facts regarding renewable energy and what I think is a road toward creating an effective policy. This is a pie chart that shows the utilities in Florida, at least the major utilities and the utility sectors. Florida Power and Light serves about half of the Floridians, 48%. Progress Energy, the utility in this area, serves 17%. If you combine all of the municipal electric utilities in Florida, we'd serve 14%. Then again, combining all the electric cooperatives, 10%. And then you have Tampa Electric and Gulf Power. This is the municipal electric utilities. There's three kinds of electric utilities in the United States. There's investor-owned utilities, which are private. You can buy shares on the New York Stock Exchange of those utilities. They're for-profit. And then they serve about 75% of all people in the U.S. There's municipal utilities, which serve about 15% of the people in the U.S. And surprisingly or interestingly, about the same number in Florida. And they're owned by cities. In Florida, these are where they are, from Blountstown down to Key West. Small cities as well as big cities, Tallahassee, Orlando, Jacksonville, Gainesville, Lakeland. In this area, also Bushnell, which is not too far away. And then there are electric cooperatives, which serve generally the rural areas. This is the municipal utilities in Florida. There's 34 of them. I showed you that picture. We serve, as I showed you in the earlier slide, 1.3 million customer meters. And we have very large utilities and some very small utilities. One key, we're not for profit. We do have profits. Those profits go back to City Hall. And so the municipal utilities are not subsidized by taxes. In fact, they actually subsidize the city operations. And one of the things that I think is important when we talk about the need for utilities to make money, from our perspective, we don't, well, I'm going to say it like this, but for the sake of just brevity, we don't care about making money. Of course, we have to cover our costs. When it comes to something like Smart Grid, which is a way for all of our communications of power plants and operations to communicate with you, with customers, so that you can make wise decisions about energy use, we just need that investment to cover its cost, to pay back over time. We don't need to make money on that. There may be other utilities that need to have a profit. We don't have to have a profit. We just need to cover those costs. I work for the trade association for those 34 municipal utilities. I live in Tallahassee. I'm a lobbyist. When we talk about all those bad guys up in Tallahassee, you can blame me. Now, that's the rotten way of looking at it. I represent utilities. When there's a proposal that's on the table, I talk about what the impact of that proposal is. We make our own proposals that we think are wise as well. So that's the process of legislative representation or lobbying. And it's the process we have. And I would invite you all to come and spend a day with me up at the Capitol. It's not as dirty as it sounds. It literally is meetings about what impacts of various proposals are and trying to find the best way forward. We do other things at our trade association. We get our utilities talking to each other, and we train them. If they answer the phone nicely, that means we trained them. If they didn't, that means they need our training. And we also coordinate mutual aid when there are hurricanes. When you see trucks moving around back and forth, lineman trucks and so on, when we have hurricanes, I'm one of the people that moves the majority of those linemen around. So I don't work for an electric utility, but I represent electric utilities. This is my car. It's a Prius. It gets 45 miles a gallon, and that's my license plate. It's outside, in case you want to see it. This is my house. That's my solar water heater. That's my 5-kilowatt photovoltaic system. I just wanted you to know that. Oh, I shouldn't have put that up yet. I want you to know that because I want you to know where I personally am I think globally, I act locally. I've taken initiatives on my own. Right now, I'm seeking bids, or whatever we call it, for a new heating and air conditioning system in my house because it's about 20 years old. It's not broken yet, but I kind of feel like it's going to break any day now. It's a good time to just reinvest and improve my efficiency by maybe 20 or 30%, lower my bills even further. If you want to know specifics about the solar system, I'm happy to talk with you about it afterwards, because it's a lot of crazy details about how that all works, and you learn a lot by putting one of those things on your house. I'm going to talk about the truth today, and if I don't, please call me on it, okay? Write a question or collar me afterwards, but I'm going to give you some things about what I believe are the truth about energy technologies. FMEA, the Florida Municipal Electric Association, we support renewable energy in Florida, responsible renewable energy. And we've been working really hard for the past 4 years on trying to get a responsible policy established. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the details about that history in just a little bit. But something important to know, renewable energy, the supply is limited in Florida. The price is higher. And we saw in that film at the beginning about grid parity. I'm going to talk about that in just a few minutes. And the solar energy, just solar, where there's other forms of renewable energy, but solar energy itself does not help a utility very much. But we have to start somewhere. There's, if we never invest in any technology, we'll never get from, of course, the wagon train to the 787. About a year ago, I arrived late. This is a true story. I arrived late at a hotel room traveling, turned on the TV, and there was this infomercial on about the Contour Core sculpting system. Now I'm going to cut to the chase here and tell you that I bought the thing. Okay, it was it was $150, and the promise was you can literally sit on your couch drinking beer, and it's the equivalent of doing sit-ups. Okay, what it does is that belt there, delivers an electric shock to your body, and it causes your muscles to contract. So you go like, whoa, and it feels like a sit-up. Whoa. Well, I used it twice. The first time it was a little weird, and the second time it was like, this might turn into cardiac arrest here. My family thought I was crazy, and fortunately, I was able to return the thing and get all my money back because I'm not sure that it was a legitimate company. But the point of that experience, or at least the lesson I learned, was buyer beware. Make sure you have all the facts before you buy something. I did go on the FTC, Federal Trade Commission's website after I bought the thing, and it said they're bogus. They don't work. Now, however, they did say that they use these things in hospitals to stimulate patients' muscles. So that's what the concept was, although they don't actually build muscle, they just stimulate muscle. So I'm not doing a commercial for that, but buyer beware. And I'm going to tell you some things that may be a little bit different from what you've heard in the past, so please keep your mind open. As I said earlier, the supply is limited in Florida. Today in Florida, we have about 50,000 megawatts of power plants. And now we're going to look at what the renewable energy potential is. Biomass, we're talking total estimate of what we have available to, and this is generally burning biomass in power plants, and that's trees, essentially, 1,500 megawatts. We have about 500 megawatts already, and this is from paper companies burning excess tree waste and so on in facilities that make electricity. They use it for themselves, for their processing, and then they also sell it back to the grid. Solar, the photovoltaic potential, about 5,000 megawatts. Now, I've seen estimates as high as 50,000 megawatts. 50,000, I mean the total that we have for power plants in Florida. And that may be possible if we have those photovoltaic cells on every house and every business. So, but at least as far as what's reasonable, about 5,000. Today we have 70 megawatts, and majority of that is utility scale, sort of, and I'll show you a utility scale project in a minute. So today we have about 1% renewables in Florida. The potential is about 13%. This is, I'm going to quickly run through some maps of the United States. This is the wind power map for the United States. In the southeast, you don't see a lot of wind opportunities. This is the offshore wind. We do have some offshore wind potential. There's a lot of friction and opposition to putting wind offshore in a state like Florida that has a heavy tourism. People don't like to see them. I personally love them. I think they're really cool, and I wouldn't mind seeing them off the coast, but there are others that don't feel the same way. This is solar in the United States. Most of the solar is in the Southwest. We do have a pretty good solar, we call it insolation, in the Southeast and in Florida. We're not quite the Sunshine State as much as Arizona, New Mexico, California is in that Southwest, but we clearly do have a lot of sunshine. And what's interesting about what I learned about having a solar system on my house, by the way, it's got a contraption on the outside of the house that shows the output at every second of the day. And I can't walk past that thing, taking out the garbage, you know, just walking out to get the mail without looking and see what my power plant is doing. And what I've learned is that when I installed the thing last October is that all winter long, the production was great. It had bright sunny days, and I produce about 26 to 30 kilowatt hours a day. And I thought in the summer, the days are going to be longer. This is really going to be awesome. I'll get 40 kilowatt hours a day. And I got less in the summer. Even though the days were longer, I thought, what's up with that? Cloud cover. You get more clouds in the day, more intermittent clouds. So I'd have days when the average is probably like 15 to 20 in the summer. Geothermal. This is hot stuff underground. You can drill underground, use that heat to heat homes or make power or make electricity. Mostly in the west, none in the east. And this is biomass. This is mostly tree resources available for burning. And you see a lot. You see a lot in the central part of the country. And I shouldn't say it's mostly trees. It's also there are crops that are grown that you can use to make electricity as well. But most of the biomass we have here in Florida is in North Florida. And we are seeing some projects as well trying to get off the ground in North Florida. Just this week, JEA in Jacksonville, the utility there, dedicated a 15 megawatt photovoltaic plant. That's the field right there. Behind it is actually a natural gas-fired plant, the little smokestack that you see there. And just so you know, it's 15 megawatts. That's direct current. In order to convert that to the grid, you lose some efficiency. You lose about 16% efficiency. So for the grid, it's only 12.6 megawatts. That's alternating current. This is what it looks like from the air. And you have the photovoltaic plant on about 100 acres, and that's the whole facility on 100 acres, the entire land mass. And then next to it, the Brandy Branch natural gas plant of 14 acres. It's interesting to look at them side by side. Let's look at the natural gas plant. 812 megawatts, a small footprint. It's available 95% of the time. Capacity factor is essentially how much that plant can be turned on. The electricity output, the cost, 7 cents a kilowatt hour. That's wholesale, 7 cents. You have to add the poles and the wires costs and so on, so that the total cost comes out to be more like 12 cents statewide. But you need natural gas to run that thing. It's got a pipeline that runs next to it, and you have to have a steady supply of natural gas. The photovoltaic plant, 100 acres, 12.6 megawatts, it's only on 17% of the time. And that's that problem that I was having at my house, is that you only got daylight to work with, and you've got cloud cover occasionally. Now, the cost of this plant, 22 cents a kilowatt hour. That's pretty cheap for solar energy utility scale. The large scale projects are the ones that can get the best prices. But of course, no fuel costs, and it'll run for 30 years without any fuel. You do have to clean that glass a couple times a year. I have to get up on my roof with a hose and a scrub brush, literally, and clean the pollen off of my power plant. So what are the costs? As I said, the average in Florida, about 12 cents a kilowatt hour. In the utility scale, 22 cents. That's that Jacksonville plant that you just saw. That's the cheapest one. There have been others that have been installed that are a little more expensive. At my house, I've done the math. I'm somewhere between 40 and 75 cents, depending on how long my system will last and how many clouds I see. But I saw kind of a range. I really found a hard time nailing down my exact price. Biomass, burning trees, and actually it's biomass, not necessarily burning trees. Logging is done, and then they leave the residue, all the branches, and that's what they burn in the power plants. There's a lot of that stuff, and that price wholesale, 15 to 20 cents. So it's a little bit more expensive. And that tree waste is carbon neutral, because if they let it sit there or they burned it, it would turn into carbon dioxide, or if it sat there, it would turn to methane. And so by growing more trees, with a managed program of growing more trees, you actually suck in the carbon back into trees. So with a managed program, it's carbon neutral. So we got to start somewhere. How do we get from the big mainframe to the iPhone? Before we do that, I got to tell you a little bit about solar. This is the curve in the middle, the blue one in the middle, the camel's hump there, is the solar output for a day. It starts about 8 a.m. and it ends about 7 or 8 p.m. Okay? The peak is right in the middle. And this is the magenta line is a customer's load during the day. And the peak is around 4 o'clock. That's the shift there. That's where the mountaintop is on the magenta line. Solar doesn't help the peak. It peaks at noon. It does, you can see the blue excess there. That's the excess production that utilities don't need. We literally don't need that. We're generating with cheaper resources, and so that's wasted energy. But we buy it back from customers because there's so few customers. But if half of the people in Florida had solar systems on the roof, the half that didn't have them would be subsidizing a lot of that electricity. This is what it's like in the winter. Again, the solar production is kind of in that middle. A lot of excess energy that utilities don't need that those solar plants are producing, because we can produce it with a lot cheaper resources off peak. On peak, we have to turn on some power plants for a very short amount of time. They're very expensive. We don't like to build those plants. We'd rather that they be generated elsewhere. But solar itself doesn't help the peak. If you have energy storage, you can do that. If we could take that solar energy, put it in something else, put it in batteries, put it in compressed air, whatever, then we could use it on peak. So we got to start somewhere. We have to start investing in these technologies so that we figure out how best to match up the best use of solar energy and other energy resources. Now, Thomas Edison is holding his original light bulb from more than 100 years ago. National security. Do renewables move us toward greater national security? Renewable energy for electricity essentially has no impact on national security. If you want national security, you got to switch cars to being electric, which is a great idea, by the way. And I won't say that electric utilities love that, because you'll think we're self-serving. But independently, I think it's a great national policy to move toward more electric cars. But if you're going to do that, you're going to need more power plants. Recognize you're going to need more power plants, whatever they are, whether they're renewable or conventional. 40% of our energy in the U.S. is for transportation. Another 40% is for electricity. So that's a lot of energy to supply through the electric system. So if you're ready for more power plants and more transmission lines, let's move everything to electric cars. If we did it all gradually, if we were able to, and I think that's what we're doing, introducing electric cars or hybrid cars that can be plugged in and charged, and then move the renewable energy technologies also into the future gradually so they can match up that load, that's the way to do it. And I think that's actually what we're doing. If you want to try to do it overnight, we'll be out of sync. But I just want you to know that when you talk about solar energy, right now, we need more solar energy, national security, mismatch. The match is electric cars give us national security. We don't import almost all of our energy resources for electricity are domestic. So very few are international. Coal, natural gas. The Holy Grail, as I described, this is the Holy Grail. Solar energy plugged in through the grid system, or not, maybe even on top of the car, to the electric car. That would be great for national security. So, recapping. Renewable energy, the supply is limited in Florida and the price is higher, and solar doesn't help the utility very much, but it could address national security. Investing in technologies will lead to greater efficiency, and it will address climate change. And I'm not going to argue with Dan about whether climate change is real or not, but I'm going to tell you that there are folks that think it's not, and there are folks that think it's absolutely real. And I don't make that judgment. I think that it's wise, even if we're uncertain, to move in the right direction. So whether you want to call it national security or climate change, whatever drives us, or economic development, whatever drives us to make those wise decisions, I think that's good policy. By the way, on I didn't mention a biomass plant that they're building in Gainesville, 100 megawatt biomass plant. They are creating 450 jobs in the Gainesville region, in Alachua County, that are replaced because they have to create all the fuel. They have to harvest all that fuel in Alachua County, and that replaces coal that they're not going to be buying from West Virginia. So that's economic development. And yes, it's a biomass plant. You could say the same for installing photovoltaic cells. You're creating an industry of installers around the state to put them up, to clean them, and so on. That's a good thing. Now I'm going to get specific. We go from where we've been talking very macro level to very specific at the micro level here in Florida. I personally, or our association, has been fighting for 4 years about renewable energy policy. And 4 years ago, we put on the table spending 2% of our gross electric utility revenues on renewable energy. 2%. That generates $400 million a year. New money every year. Now, I'm going to tell you at the time, this is what happened. Charlie Crist was talking about 20% by 2020. We can do it. The environmentalists said 400 million, that's not enough. We want $1 billion. Nothing passed. Nothing passed. 400 million, that 2% proposal was supported by Florida Power and Light, Progress Energy, and environmentalists wanted $1 billion. Am I blaming environmentalists for it? Yeah, I am. Because it was a legitimate proposal. It was a legitimate proposal, and they backed away. Now we have a slow economy. It doesn't matter. We talk about that proposal, it'll never pass the legislature. It's $4 a month. Will people pay $4 a month? Well, some will, but a lot of folks won't, and the legislature won't go down that road. Now we're talking about this, a public benefits fund of 25 cents a month. And in a minute, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you'll support this. And it's just a straw poll. I'm not a politician. But I just want to know. I'm curious to know. Because that would raise $30 to $40 million a year. It would fund the backlog of the photovoltaic rebate program, like the one that I got on my house there. You know, a huge rebate for doing that. It'll fund the backlog. There's $50 million in backlog. It'll also pay for, going forward, more weatherization, more efficiency, larger grant ideas for renewable energy across the state. Anything more complicated, in my opinion, more than 25 cents a month, $3 a year per meter, anything more complicated won't pass. Money doesn't grow on trees. If this is your image of why we need to move forward, keep it to yourself. And I say this because that argument doesn't work with this legislature. I'm telling you, at the micro level, at the Florida level, that argument doesn't work because they're back here. Money doesn't grow on trees, folks. And don't give me this baloney, because that's the doomsday scenario that will cause us not to act. So, what's good public policy? We need to stop the hyperbole, stop whining, stop dreaming, I think, be practical, and recognize that with 25 cents, I'm going to ask you this question now, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single small step. So, I want to see your hands. How many people would pay 25 cents a month to do this? This is almost unanimous. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry. Our next speaker is Dr. Dale Brill from the Florida Chamber of Commerce Foundation. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody. It's dangerous to be last when you've got the brainiacs and the policy experts that go before you, and then you're the guy from the Chamber Foundation, and people are trying to figure out now, is that the foundation or is that the Chamber? And when you have to explain yourself to an audience, that's never a good start either. Well, let's start there if that's okay. But before I do that, I think we're remiss. This is an exciting conversation to be part of. And representing the Florida Chamber Foundation is unique for me because I've only had the job since January, so I'm still kind of the new kid finishing that first year. You know, in a product, when marketers introduce into a product, you still get to call it new and improved for a year. And I can still blame the people that had the job before I got there. I've got that window of opportunity. But before I do that, I want to make sure that in my old job, that was customary and I think wholly appropriate to recognize the elected officials that are part of this conversation with you. And I know Senator Jones, Representative Long, you want to give a wave to everybody, say hello? Okay, great. And I'm going to ask you to give them one more round of applause. Are there any other elected officials in the room, if you could raise your hand? Okay, good to see you, sir. That's absolutely right. Wonderful. A round of applause for, here's why, though. Here's why. Think about what it takes nowadays, the courage to put your family, your reputation, your energy, your time, etc., on the line, to live in the fishbowl, to be part of the most difficult conversations probably any generation has faced in a very, very long time, if ever. To do that on behalf of people that are very, very hard to please, you all, right? You're a tough crowd. And they do that every day for us. So one more time, a round of applause for the folks willing to represent you. Okay, now that I've pandered to that audience, let me pander to the rest of you. Let me, if I may, this is a first for me, a huge first, because I've never started out a presentation by telling you what I'm not going to do. But I'm going to tell you what I'm not going to do by first explaining the differences I keep teasing you with between the Florida Chamber Foundation and the Florida Chamber of Commerce. The foundation, in the introduction, and I think there's the bio in there that my mother helped me write, talks about what we do. And I want to underscore that is that we are the think tank or the policy development arm. We get paid to think, and that's a wonderful thing to do. Previously, I was in government and as officially a bureaucrat, as you can read there, and I'm not quite sure I thought a lot or thought enough. And now I get to think again, and that's exciting. I do not lobby. Not that there's anything wrong with lobbyists. It's a noble profession. No, I kid. That conversation is very important, whether it happens on the 22 floors of the Capitol or whether it happens in local communities. But the foundation does not lobby. We develop and we ask questions around the very things that we're talking about today and ask questions about what are those policy options. We toss those policy options over to the chamber itself and they advocate. They have their own policy council, they have their own board of directors. There is a firewall, if you will, a thick brick wall between what the foundation does in its thinking and the policy council decisions. Our focus as a foundation, as my slide and the cover slide indicates, is 2030. So if it's about to happen in the next legislative session, I'm really not tied to it, neither is my team. If it's about to happen maybe in the next legislative session, well, we're really not tied to that as well unless there's a loose connection to our thinking as we look for 2030. So I want to introduce to you today Project 2030, because in the headline of this particular forum number 3 is the path to policy. I want to suggest to you and share with you how the business community, at least through the Florida Chamber Foundation, is trying to engage as fast and as quickly and as strongly as it possibly can in the very important discussion that we're having right now. And one more piece of housekeeping. It seems like we've got a little global warming in the building. I can see the fans. If we've got anybody that can crank up or crank down the air conditioning, I'm sure it's solar powered, and that would be great. So this is the obligatory data slide. If you've had your head under a rock for the last 2.5 years, you know that we're suffering and it's a painful environment. So I wanted to give you a sense of that. There's only a little bit of good news on my data points. That is that in-migration is starting to rebound a little bit. We expect that over time it will rebound because this is and will continue to be the most premier, pristine place to retire, and eventually it will be the most pristine and premier place to work. Okay, it is for a lot of people, and it's going to be for more folks. So we as a foundation expect us to get back to about between 5 and 7 million new folks coming in between now and 2030. Now, those of you that are media hog, and by the way, any journalists in the audience? Love journalists. All right, wonderful. Journalists in the room. A journalist, one of my favorites, authored that initial story, the one in the dead center, the Wall Street Journal article about 2.5 years ago. I don't know if you remember seeing it. It said, "Is Florida over?" Show of hands, you remember that Saturday? That's when and I was in the governor's office at the time. When you see a headline like that on the Wall Street Journal, your throat goes down to your toes. And you go, oh my gosh, and you stop, you miss a flight because you were so engrossed in reading this article, true story, missed a flight, and said, can this be happening to me? This is the only other thing that I can imagine is CBS 60 Minutes knocking on the door and saying, Dale, we're here to talk to you. Well, journalists, being the creative lot that they are, piled on. And you can see the stories that then kind of followed that. And again, you start asking yourself, well, do we deserve it? And the answer was yes. But more importantly, what's the answer to the question? And as a policy development person, as a think tanker, I'm here to put this to rest. I can answer this question definitively for you, without question and without insecurity and being wrong. The answer to the question, is Florida over, is yes. The Florida that you knew 5 years ago is gone. That's exciting news. We have a huge and an amazing opportunity to steer and point to a new direction and decide what we want to be. Now, the Florida that I'm sharing with you that is gone is the Florida that relied on the three-legged stool of the economy. Those of you that are not economists or not familiar with this, is that our economy, it was completely sufficient when we were the 5th cheapest state in the union. You want to know what your economic development policy is when you're 5th cheapest state in the union? Come on down, y'all. And that's what we did. We relied on agriculture, tourism, and development. Now, it would be a mistake for you to leave, or anybody that's watching this, to draw the conclusion that that guy from the Florida Chamber Foundation came down and said that they don't care about agriculture, they don't care about tourism, and they don't care about development. That's wholly incorrect. It's a mischaracterization. It is that those 3 key industries are no longer sufficient to drive the economic growth that we're going to need to provide prosperity for all Floridians. It's just not enough. So if you're a visual person, I want you to envision that we're trying to grow or build an economy that looks like a skyscraper whose ground floors and foundations are agriculture, tourism, and the development businesses. But we've got to do a whole lot more, and we can. So if we're going to have 5 to 7 more people coming, whether we're talking about energy policy or we're talking about water policy or fill in the blank about what the policy needs are of this state, we've got to do a much better job planning for the next 5 to 7 million people than we did the most recent 5 to 7 million. And are we in agreement so far? Are we okay? Okay. That's a good sign. So how do we write the new story for Florida's economy? What does that look like? What does that look like? Well, I want to share with you, and I appreciate the emphasis in the previous presentation about problems, because our research also indicates, without question, there are 3 kinds of problems. There's my problems, there's your problems, but the third category is the category of problems that always get solved first. Can you imagine what they are? Our problems. And folks, it's been clear. I don't have to emphasize what the experts have just told you. We've got a problem. Now, at the intersection of that problem, we have a choice. We can evolve and we can find solutions for those problems together, or we can die watching and doing nothing. Agreement across the board. It is time to do something. And again, the path to policy development from the business community, as far as its involvement with the Florida Chamber Foundation, looks a little like what I'm about to share with you. Now, let's go ahead and call out what the problem is. From an economic development perspective, firmly believe that our problem is that we've relied on our roadmap to yesterday is supposed to try to get us to tomorrow. And I think that we've all indicated by the aphorisms and the adages and the quotes, et cetera, that we've shared with you, is that what got us here isn't going to get us there. Are we in agreement there? Amen. We're going to get a church. This is wonderful. So the answer must be some kind of plan. Now, those of you iPhone users, raise your hand. I know you're proud. You want the world to get iPhone users, right? Droid, folks. Any droids out there? A little chip on your shoulder. It's not an iPhone, I know. BlackBerry. Oh, yeah, BlackBerry's for business. BlackBerry's business. Don't play with an iPhone. They play with an iPhone. Anyway, BlackBerry users. Okay. And then there's the torch buyers that just can't decide. I want a BlackBerry. Okay, that kind of stuff. I want you right now to go ahead and find for me the strategic plan for the future of Florida, the strategic plan for the future of Florida, let's say on a 15, 20, or 30-year horizon. And while you're doing that, you're probably also, I'm going to jump ahead and say, I'm going to imagine that you agree with me that if you have a plan, you have to measure your progress or your regress along that plan. Those of you that are in businesses, whether you're business owners, you work for businesses, or just your own household, you have a sense of how you're doing. I'm guessing you know about how much money's in your checking account. I guess you know about how much money goes out of your household on a monthly basis. So that numbers help, and we have to measure things. Your life is more data-driven than it's ever been in the past. Wouldn't it be amazing to know that A, we have a strategic plan for the state of Florida, B, that it has a process that has embraced as many diverse voices as possible to create that plan, and 3, that we've got a means to track it and measure it. That sounds like a plan for doing something to me. That's what we're proposing at the foundation. So those of you that, I also teach at Florida State, and enjoy that very much. I can appreciate the idea of walking in, having a whiteboard behind you and a class that's asleep in front of you. When I was with the legislature, it was a little different. The people behind me in the committee presentations, those were the ones that were asleep, and the legislators in front were on their BlackBerries. Of course, verifying the data of everything that was being presented to them at the time. But what I'd like you to do is being a professor, I want to just make sure that we've got agreement that these are the basic elements of a plan. Right? They can vary a little bit here, but I want to show you what I've chosen to highlight on the top is the part that we are trying to drive as a foundation on a statewide basis. The part that's on the bottom is a gray area. While we're still going to come up with objectives and the strategies that make sense for the state, that's where the intersection happens with local communities. And so what I want to share with you is how do we get there? How do we get to a plan that makes sense? Because businesses have been doing it, families do it, they have some kind of plan. How do we get there as a team? Well, the first thing in a plan, as I've indicated in the outline I just showed you, is that we have to have a vision. Now, the Florida Chamber of Commerce, on its policy council side, and with the help of the foundation, has come up with a 3-part vision. I think this is difficult to refute. It is, it's powerful because it's simple, it's memorable, and it says, we want high-wage jobs and prosperity for all Floridians. Now, we can argue about the definition of what is high wage, right? But we can say that we want people to have more personal income, we want wealth creation for individuals in the state. We want them to be able to take care of their families, the health care, education, et cetera. We want that. We want that for our Floridians. The second one is we want sustainable and vibrant communities. I hope long gone is the perception that the business community is at odds with what's good for the state of Florida. Because if you crush and if you shoot the golden goose, if you don't take care of what got you here, it is impossible to go any further forward. So we are heavily vested in a sustainable and a vibrant community. Again, a charged word is sustainable. What does that mean? We need to talk about that. And then the third piece is global leadership, and this we've got location, location, location. You don't need to be a restaurateur to know that location is everything. And we are gifted and blessed to be in a position to take advantage of our geography and 14 deep water points to be global leaders. So that's a vision. Any just vehement disagreement with me on this point that that's a reasonable direction to head? We're okay so far. Now you're wondering, okay, what's he backing me into? Nothing. We got more in common, folks, and you've heard this phrase, we've got more in common together than we've got that separates us. And that gives me great optimism for this conversation and many more that need to happen on a statewide basis. So a common language. How important is a common language? I'll tell you, because lobbyists are wonderful people. There's a lot of them. There are a lot of them. I believe there are 21 or 2,200 registered lobbyists that walk the halls in Tallahassee. That means that your senator and your representative have to, sit down and talk to as many as they possibly can fit in and hear their opinion. So when one sits down and picks up and leaves, I'm imagining your average day is that 30 seconds later, there's another one sitting right there. And the problem with the business community as it is trying to, when it does advocate for a position, is that it's a fragmented voice. I've heard and talked to legislators who say, well, you know, I can't even tell if you guys are on the same page. You don't even use the same language. So can you give me some sense that there's agreement on what do you want? What is our plan? Well, one way to solve that is to use a framework that we've identified through an analysis of strategic planning that has taken place over the past decades. Raise your hand if you've been part of a strategic planning or community process like that where you, yeah, and if you're like me when somebody says, oh, we're going to do strategic planning, you run for a spoon to gouge your eyes out. There is nothing more painful to me than sitting through a strategic planning session, and I want to animate that pain for you today. Now, no expense has been spared for this, all right? This is a Disney animation of my vision of what happens in a strategic planning process. Let's get it started. Oh, I've got an idea. No, you know what I think our priority ought to be? No, let's do this. Well, Jim, I really disagree with you because I think the most important thing we need to work on is over here. And this is what happens. We are throwing spaghetti against the wall, if you will, or eggs or whatever object you want to throw against the wall, but representing ideas. And when we're done, we've spent probably, anywhere from a full day to 3 days, possibly weeks, depending on your strategic planning process, to get to this. You've also paid a facilitator who I'm sure is quite qualified to spend some more time and say, you know what's interesting? That's very interesting. What you have here really is this. Now that cost you about $15,000. You also lost 3 to 6 months to get to that. Then, if you've got even more money and a great facilitator, of course, very highly qualified, they will come back to you and tell you that, no, what you really have now is this upon further review. Now, all kidding aside, that is what happens. You've done it, right? You've seen it happen. You find commonalities, and then once you find commonalities, you try to structure it and say, how can we talk about this together? Because a planning process has to have a framework that facilitates that discussion. So I've made fun of it, but it's how you have to do it. But wouldn't it be neat? I know that you've said that we've got a couple years to spare. I was ADD before ADD was cool. I want us to get to solutions faster than a couple of years. I'm not convinced we've got, I know we don't have 5 to 10 years to figure this out. We've got to get to answers, folks. So let's not reinvent the wheel, at least from the foundation's perspective. We've done this, as I've indicated, we've looked at strategic plans throughout the business community and economic development organizations, et cetera, throughout the state of Florida, and found that when we really do is have something like that, and we've made it a little bit cleaner and said that's what it looks like. What you're looking at is what we have introduced as the 6 pillars of the future of Florida, future of Florida's economy. And you get a sense of, and my apologies, it is hard to read, but on the far left, we start with talent, supply, and education. We go across the board, and we end with quality of life and quality places. And I challenge you to give me an idea, give me whether it's energy policy or water policy, or whether it's transportation, or whether it's healthcare, or whether it's disaster preparedness, whether it's disaster response, workforce, pre-K, they fit into one of these pillars. And we have organized our discussion to get towards, again, a path to policy, is to embrace those 6 pillars and organize around those 6 pillars to have a conversation that needs to happen around each of those individual issues that fall within the pillars. So there is a caucus, and this is what I want to introduce you today, because anytime I speak, ladies and gentlemen, I'm a selfish person. I will just go ahead and admit this. My ex-wife will admit that. And my selfishness today is I need one thing out of you. I need your engagement. I need you to say, okay, I'm willing enough to maybe step forward and participate, and again, in the next forum and the continuing dialogue that happens here with energy. But you know what? That foundation seems to at least have enticed me enough to say, I'll tiptoe into that and see if that's for real. I know we've got to earn your trust, and we've got to demonstrate that we're credible in what we're trying to do in this conversation. But these 6 pillars each have a caucus organized around each of those pillars. So if you're interested in infrastructure and growth leadership, by the way, we call it growth leadership because growth management, we're convinced we've managed growth to death. How do we lead? How do we make smart decisions that are tied to the rest of the economy? Quality of life, quality places. If you care about the environment, water pollution, et cetera, even civic discourse. How can we have conversations where we disagree with each other and agree with each other and not fall into ad hominem arguments or whether it's about you or it's about me? It's about the issues. We can do all that. So I want to invite you to participate in one of the 6 caucuses. If you're interested, I'm going to ask you to do one of 2 things. I'm going to send me an email. My email address is first initial last name, dbrill @flfoundation.org. Pretty simple, dbrill @flfoundation.org. Normally I would give out my cell phone number. And I really do, but because this is being broadcast, I have no idea where that's going to land. So let's just stick with the email address. But please, if you're interested, and just say, hey, Dale, tell me more about this caucus system. I'd like to involve you to be part of this. Okay, so lastly, we have to have measurement. What have I introduced so far? I've introduced a common language, a common framework, which is the 6 pillars. I've introduced a process, which is the 6 caucuses, to bring people together who don't agree, who don't see the world the same way, but in a kind and civil conversation over time. And this isn't one that we're going to try to figure out in 3 months. This one is going to go on for years. But the solutions will emerge each quarter. The third thing I want to share with you is measurement, because in business particularly, we know this for true. And again, I'm convinced it's true in your homes. You can't manage what you don't measure. You can't manage what you don't measure. How are we measuring it? We have introduced last October the Florida Scorecard. It's available at thefloridascorecard.com. It's not a mistake that the bottom 6 dials correspond to the 6 pillars that I've introduced in the framework. It answers the question, how is the state of Florida doing? Because until we started measuring things like this, I'm convinced, and I haven't been proven wrong on this yet, that we were left to anecdote, conjecture, opinion, or if we were lucky enough to have experts who could bring data to us. But how many of you, you've given up your Saturday morning on a gorgeous Florida day to do this, but how many of us have access to the brain power that we have this morning on a regular basis? What if your Rotary Club asked the question, how is talent, supply, and education right now? What is the state of the state when it comes to talent, supply, and education? And instead of people say, well, I think or I heard, boom, you could pop up the Florida Scorecard and you could take a look and see data points, because behind each of those 6 dials, there are more than 100 indicators that identify how things are. Baccalaureate degree production. Well, why do you care about that? Because we need over 1 million new degrees. Just in normal economic growth, we need a million more degrees that our current system is not built to provide. We identify those gaps, and so that we can do policy conversations around the gaps or where the state wants to go and where we are currently. That's an informed conversation, folks. That's a data-driven conversation that then can bring us together around a framework and a process and measurement. So just to give you that example, there's an example of talent, supply, and education. I think the one that will be of most interest to you, there's innovation and economic development, the 2nd pillar, and some of the key elements are on the left-hand side. But I want to get to infrastructure and growth leadership. There we are with transportation, trade routes, communication, energy, water, conservation, environment, sustainability, and preparedness. I'm just guessing that's the one of most interest to those of you that are here this morning. Now, I know what you're thinking. Dale, that's nice. The state matters to me. I'm a Floridian, and I care, and I love the state of Florida. But you know what? What about my community? Where's the data for my community? Tell me how my community is doing. I'm happy to tell you that on October 11th, just a few days from now, we will be introducing the Florida Scorecard 2.0 that will introduce the data that is available for the state on a community basis by county, and it's also be available by what we call an MSA, or the Metropolitan Statistical Area, which is your major cities. So this data will then be provided, so you could start your Rotary clubs after next week. You could start your meetings, your board meetings, your community meetings with how are we doing? Now, granted, some of this data only changes every 4 years. Some of this data changes on a monthly basis, but we aim to provide it to you. So our mission, in conclusion, is that we have to have this conversation. I'm excited and just humbled to be a part of the folks that are here that know so much about it, and you that care so much about it, to have this conversation. My role today, I said I'm here to tell you what it's not about, is not to share with you what the Chamber's views are, what the policy decisions, or what we're going to advocate for. I don't advocate. But I'm completely dedicated, have chosen to wake up every morning, by the way, without an alarm clock, because it's an exciting job to have, is to be part of the process that is going to help our state get to some policy developments, because the time is now. Okay, I feel compelled to close with a song or a quote. I'm going to show my age. There's a Seals and Crofts song that says, "We may never pass this way again." I won't sing it to you, but I guarantee that those words will ring true if you think about them. We owe it to ourselves if you're selfishly motivated as I am. You owe it to your children and your grandchildren, and you owe it to each other to have this conversation together. And I hope that you will consider participating in that process, the path to policy development that is being enabled by the Florida Chamber Foundation. Thank you for your time and your energy.
Let's give another big round of applause to all of our panelists. Seals and Crofts, they did Summer Breeze, didn't they? That's a flashback. We're going to continue now with the panel discussion and questions, and to lead that is Susan Glickman. She's the director of the Florida Business Network for a Clean Energy Policy and has consulted on this topic all around the state and the nation, and we're very fortunate to have her moderating the panel. You should have cards in your program. This is a time for you during this discussion to fill out those cards, and then folks will be coming by to pick those up to bring them to me during the audience question time. So at this point, let me introduce Susan Glickman. Susan.
Thank you, Dr. Oliver, and thank you to all the panelists. I'm going to throw out just a couple discussion points, because really this is about you all commenting on each other's presentations, because we're trying to actually get somewhere. We've talked about the problems of drilling. Obviously, this community was watching that very closely. We know we need to do, we have, agreement that we need to do things differently. So now the question is, how do we get there? So if you'd like to, and I'll go ahead and start with you, and we'll just kind of run through real quick if you wanted to make a sort of a general comment on something someone else said. But the main thing that we're interested in is we can have cleaner fuels, we can make cars run more efficiently, we have zero energy homes. So what are these barriers to clean energy? What is it that we need to overcome in this process to really move in a serious way to clean energy? So Dan?
Thanks, Susan. So I'll just make one brief comment on each of the other presentations, which I think were all great and I think complement each other in useful ways, and then put that in the context of how we move forward. So David talked about the difficulty of building new power plants and the load growth projections, which say we're going to really be facing a crisis in reliability if load continues to grow much faster than we're able to build new capacity. I want to just make one point about that, which is that load growth projections are not destiny. In the 70s, the electric industry projected that electricity demand would grow 7% per year forever, and they were going to build, 1,000 nuclear power plants to meet that load. Well, it didn't happen. It didn't happen for a lot of reasons. One was, as electricity became more expensive as they were building new power plants, people figured out, well, maybe we could figure out how to conserve. And we have a lot of new technology on the demand side which hadn't been accounted for in those projections. So I think we can avoid that kind of load growth, and with the kinds of efficiency measures, and actually they were very well illustrated in the film we saw at the very beginning, we can really stabilize load growth. And that's really important. It doesn't solve all of our problems, but it buys us time to put in place the other kinds of solutions that we've been talking about. So I think that's important. And to make that happen, and it's sort of moving into the policy, Barry talked about, well, what's good for utilities? And you may not, love your utility, but the reality is we do have to make it profitable for utilities to do the right thing.
To end up where you're headed, different directions that we
rate
can go.
Structures so that, particularly for the investor-owns, municipals will drive, have a somewhat different set of incentives, but particularly for the investor-owns that do make a return, we can design a rate structure so that it's actually more profitable to become more efficient. Normally, you sell less electricity. I mean, it's different. You have to think about your business model a little bit differently. If you're a utility, you think your business model is to sell more electricity, that's going to be a problem. If you think of your business model as, I want to give my customers services from energy. So what my customers care about is that their home stays cool in the summer, warm in the winter. How can I provide that? Then your goal is not necessarily to sell more electricity. And if you reward utilities, I think you can do this in municipals as well as investor-owned, for delivering that in the lowest cost way to their customers, then you have a very positive cycle. And so, to get a little bit wonky about it, one of the specific things that you need to do is you need to decouple the utilities' revenues from how much electricity they sell. Because if when they sell less electricity, they automatically get less total revenue. You can tell them to have efficiency programs, but if every time they're successful at delivering energy efficiency programs, guess what? They'll do efficiency programs, they'll go through the motions to make the regulators happy, but they won't do a very good job of it. You've got to align their financial incentives with your social goals. And there's examples of how we've done that around the country, so that I think that's a very important direction forward. And so
I had a
foundation. Second comment, just in terms of renewables, I think Barry took his mission as trying to convince you that renewables are not going to be the panacea. We're not going to be able to overnight switch to an entirely renewable system and get rid of all those evil fossil fuels that I talked about. And he's right. We're not going to get there overnight. I think he perhaps dumped a little more cold water on it than is necessary or appropriate. The capacity that is
potentially available, particularly from solar, but also from biomass, depends on technology, and the technology is improving. It's absolutely correct, as he said, that renewables are more expensive than fossil fuels in the short run if all you're looking at is just the dollars and cents of the cost. If you look at some of the issues that I talked about in terms of environmental sustainability, security, and employment, then I think you get a different picture, and you get a different picture and you look out over time as the costs of new technology come down as we invest in them. So we have to have a system for moving forward and investing in those, and the costs are in fact coming down quite quickly. And to put that together, again, it won't happen overnight, but and he emphasized the sort of disconnect between maybe the peak of when solar output is and the load. But if you think about connecting several technologies that were mentioned, photovoltaics, smart grid, electric vehicles, which have batteries in them, can serve as storage, and maybe some external electricity storage to shift demand, and not necessarily for days, but just for hours, so that you can store some electricity during peak times, and load management, which allows you to manage where the peak power is. A lot of capacity or demand for electricity that's just automatically on can be managed in a way that doesn't actually interrupt people's service that they want. And so if you just make sure that everybody's air conditioner is not running at exactly the same time, you can shave your peak without actually preventing people from keeping their homes at a comfortable temperature during the afternoon. So when you start combining those technologies, you can really do a lot more with renewables. Again, we won't get there overnight. And, I started with a Chinese proverb that says, if we don't change the direction we're going, we're going to end up where we're headed. Barry ended with one that said that every journey starts with a single step. So I agree with that. I think that's a good bookend on that. And then just very briefly, Dale, I really appreciate your presentation because I love data, and I think it's great to have a data-driven process. So thank you.
Very good. Dave?
Thanks. I actually get a little better start here because I get to respond to Dan's presentation and his remarks, so that's good. I agree with Dan. I think you've heard a lot of very good information here. I would tend to back up Barry's pessimism because I know where Barry's coming from. Barry and I both believe that we need to have a huge influx of renewable energy in this state. We have to think of it practically.
How much that plant can do.
Okay. The truth about solar is when people talk about solar, they're talking from two different communities. Solar people like to talk in megawatts. Utilities like to talk in gigawatts.
I really thought.
All right, that's not even that's 3 orders of magnitude difference in scale, and that's why there's always this disagreement. Well, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, you don't know what you're talking about. It goes on all the time. We've got to cut through that. All right. In 1983, the first 1 megawatt solar plant came on sale for a wholesale power producer. All right, you know how much power it produced? Its output was about 126 kilowatts per acre. Guess what? That plant that Barry put up there and showed you, the one that's being built right now, its capacity is 126 kilowatts per acre. The only thing that's changed is the cost of it has come down by a factor of 5. All right, cost is coming down, but the capacity is not going up, and the energy storage is not coming. All right, so if I were to try to replace a 200 megawatt carbon plant with solar, all right, right now the capacity factor in this state is somewhere between 15 and 20% on average. That means I got to put
and they backed away.
Place one 200 megawatt carbon plant. All right, so the $3.30 price per watt for solar, if you normalize it for carbon displacement, which is what we really should be talking about, strategies that displace carbon, becomes $33 a watt. All right, it's going to be expensive. Barry believes wholeheartedly in doing this. I believe wholeheartedly in doing it. We have to understand that it's an expensive proposition. Our grandchildren depend on us making the right choices. Okay. Now, everything else Dan said, I think I agree with, but that one I will stand with Barry wholeheartedly on. And there's only one thing in Barry's entire thing that he said that I disagree with, and that's the 25 cents going into what he calls community benefit fund. I'd like to call it a community opportunity fund. But without a policy, the ratepayer has no choice in his utility mix. Why penalize the person who doesn't have a say in his destiny? Rather than you making it a downstream charge, we need to make it an upstream charge so that the utilities and their distributors and their wholesale suppliers pay it. We need to put the price on the carbon equivalent that crosses our border. Everything else, what he's trying to do, I agree with, but why make the person who has no choice in his destiny pay the bill? Making an upstream charge, and every time carbon equivalent crosses our border, put it into the same thing. And rather than calling it a benefit fund, let's call it an opportunity fund so we can invest in our infrastructure, so we can invest in the alternative energies and everything like that. And Dale, I had no problem with anything you said at all. Okay, thanks a lot.
Barry, go ahead and make a comment.
Thank you, Susan. Your question was, what are the barriers to clean energy? And I think I emphasized
What they have some kind of plan.
the idea of taking small steps as opposed to large steps. And actually, I was a large step supporter, but I've had so much cold water thrown on me in this debate that I've just said, you know, what could possibly pass? And that's where I've landed on kind of this teeny-weeny little effort that would help us move in the right direction, because once the camel's nose is under the tent with 25 cents, well, maybe, you know, in a year or 2 or 3, you can make it 35 cents or 45 cents. And then maybe you can say, well, maybe we ought to change
Future of Florida's economy.
of the incentive a little bit.
Our
the
discussion
point is,
to get.
it's important to start somewhere. Enron was a big step. It turned out to be a step in the wrong direction, but it was a big step. So if you take a big step, then there's a chance that it could be the wrong step. So I don't equate these investments to Enron, and I apologize for using that as an example, because this is not Enron. But the point is, if you take a wild step in one direction, then you run the risk of making the wrong step. So that's why I'm now a proponent of taking a small step and then knowing that that's an appropriate step, and then evaluating that as Dale would, you know, using data and saying, well, I think this is the right direction. The needle has moved a little bit, and let's keep going in that direction. Gainesville Regional Utilities has been a leader in efficiency and renewable.
Let me introduce Susan Glickman.
There's just an interesting concept here. That is that their rates are around average for Florida. They're around 12 cents a kilowatt hour. They have the lowest energy consumption per person in Florida. The average in Florida is around 1,200 kilowatt hours a month. Your average is probably around that a month. Theirs is 850. What they've done is they've invested in energy efficiency and renewable energy, and they've helped people lower their bills. They've helped people lower their consumption. So even though their electric rate is the same, those are fixed costs around their utility, they've taken initiatives to help people install better refrigerators and air conditioners and so on, so they're actually using less energy. And that's pretty cool. And that's a direction that we all need to go in. Last thing, well, two quick things. One is, we talked briefly about goals, about setting big goals, and the one we heard a few years ago, 20% by 2020. I want to tell you something about why that goal scared utilities. It doesn't scare me personally, but why it scared utilities when we talked about legislating it is because we are very data-driven and we're very goal-driven. And when you put a goal, if it's a what'd you call it? Sort of a non-binding goal. There was another name you had for it, I think. But if it's a non-binding goal, then that's fine. I think that's great. Or an aspirational goal, I think you mentioned. I think that's great. If it's a specific goal that has rewards and penalties associated with it, when we know it's unachievable, then that gives us problems, because we work in a very strict regulatory environment where if the power goes out, by the way, we get fined millions of dollars by the National Electric Reliability Corporation. So we're very concerned about rules. So if we want to set an aspirational goal, that's perfectly fine. If we want to set it specific, we got to make sure that it's attainable. And the last thing that David just said is about where do you put the money? You know, like, is 25 cents, you know, that comes out of your electric bill every month the right place to do it? The answer is no. He's right. The right place to do it is to put that cost on the purchaser are actually on the cost of the fuel, on the carbon fuel, coal or
Displace carbon.
Yes. And that's where that cost should come from, because it'll raise the cost of that stuff and it'll lower the cost, or comparably, of the renewable energy. The problem is you can't do that. We cannot do that in this political and regulatory environment. Well, you know, we can argue all day long. I'm just telling you, it's not going to happen. So that's why I'm a proponent of going right to you all and saying, hey, you know, let's just do 25 cents, start there, and then we'll try to attack that policy in a more positive way down the road.
All right, Dale, go ahead. And then as also a lobbyist, I'm going to comment a couple of your remarks, Barry, but after Dale has a chance.
Well, only very little to say, because I had the advantage of following the three gentlemen, and I tried to work in, again, there was no disagreement, just fascination with the expertise that's at the table. I'm more of the, and I hope this is true to my think tankish kind of perspective. I took notes about what I want to know more about. And I want to know more about, I think, David, you talked about push versus pull approaches. And I think that, again, the business community is probably more interested in one than another. And you tied into the 4 T's of a strategic plan, so I think there was considerable
Now,
talking about, in particular, the last one of tone, and how important buy-in is versus this authoritarian or compliance approach and those types of things. And so for us to get into buy-in, it has to be buy-in on both sides, both the business community, but also you as consumers and folks who patronize those businesses that are either on your side or not on your side. And again, I want to end this war metaphor. I think we need to get way past. So again, I'm just grateful to be here, and I've got questions for these gentlemen on the side, but I don't want to embarrass myself with my ignorance about some of the things they mentioned. But I'll be including them in the caucus.
in the last
Okay. So I wanted to give everyone a chance to sort of comment on those questions. I think that one of the themes that came up today was about where the incentives are and the way utilities are regulated in Florida, which is really a system that I think, you know, set up a lot of it in the 1970s, really at the Florida Public Service Commission is referred to as who regulates. But we're really behind the game. So there's 17 states that get a percentage or a percentage and a half of energy efficiency savings, and Florida's at 0.25. And, you know, there were some tongue-in-cheek references to sort of the back rooms and the negotiating, but there's a reason that we're not saving energy. And as Dan pointed out, utilities fundamentally, investor-owned utilities that are for-profit fundamentally don't want to sell less electricity any more than McDonald's wants to sell less hamburgers. So we need to have an honest look with the business community. And I can tell you there's not really unanimity. Groups like the Florida Retail Federation that represent all the retail businesses, they pay electric bills, or the Industrial Power Users Group. They're big users, so they are concerned that when we go to certain kinds of energy over another. So Florida utilities, investor-owned, are fundamentally incentivized to build new power plants, and Dave referred to this quite a bit as well, because that's how they make money with a return on equity. So we, in this community, are looking at rate impacts everywhere from $8 to $68 a month over the next decade, and those are filings by Progress Energy on nuclear costs. So we need to sort of look at if we can capture more efficiency and avoid building a new expensive new power plant while these new renewables come down. That's sort of a package that works together. So we do need to be, and Dale, I think this also goes to your broader approach of the state of Florida. We're not very good at looking at long-term costs, life cycle costs. That was something, there are a lot of really good questions, and a couple people brought that up about the quality of your life and these long-term kinds of costs. So we don't talk a lot about the externalities. Florida pays $925 million in public health costs for the cost of coal every year. $369 million come out of Crystal River, but you don't see that factored in when we're talking. We tend to hear more about how solar panels cost too much. But we do know that by 2020, our electric rates, which are now 12 cents a kilowatt hour, will be 21 cents a kilowatt hour. You heard a little bit about that in the early video. So I think we need to realign the conversation because we've been used to cheap electricity at 8 cents, now it's 12 cents, but it's going to go up. So when people talk about more cost, the cost as compared to what? So those were just a couple things I wanted to throw out. And then, of course, Barry talked about the lobbyists and the environmentalists. Let me just mention that in 2009, the Florida Senate passed what was called a clean energy portfolio standard of 20%. It actually included 5% for nuclear with a 2% price cap, and as Barry mentioned, that equates to about $400 million. So that passed the Senate, and then it was met with offshore drilling and nothing happened. Last year, the House passed a voluntary measure with that means no target. So one of the things we've talked about is creating market pull uncertainty, and in order to do that, you have to create a certain market, a renewable energy market. That's what we're lacking in Florida, just to boil it down. So in 2010, a voluntary measure passed that would allow the utilities to do renewables if they wanted, at whatever cost they wanted, and then pass the cost on to the customers or recover their costs. That had a 2% price cap, and that passed the House. So I certainly supported, and other people who came from the environmental perspective supported that 2% price cap. So anyway, I wanted to only slightly disagree with you on that. So those were just a couple comments that I wanted to sort of bring together. And the questions, we had questions that are as far reaching from people saying we can't really get at this problem if we don't get at fundamental problems like population and the role that capitalism plays, because even though there is definite truth to saying this kind of does have to work for the utilities to make it work because of the system that we have, but the role of capitalism and sort of money at all costs. So, and I'm just going to throw a few things out because they were so really diverse. And people
A very wide-ranging public discussion.
if the utility can't get the money for this $20 billion nuclear power plant, how are we going to then get the money for these renewables and the role of other more specific questions like the role of cogeneration and
Those are better to move you in the right.
community planning. Dean Levengood asked the question about how do we get local governments and utilities to wrap clean energy. There actually was legislation in 2008 that had regional planning councils consider energy in their long-term regional planning. I don't know that that's really being done at great length, but and also a couple questions about offshore drilling and drilling on the verge perhaps of happening in Cuba. We're reading that it's going to happen. So those are a couple questions. Would any one of you like to kind of comment on that issue of really any of those things, on the role of population or quality of life and capitalism and how we're gonna fund this move? Is that too broad a question for you?
Actually, I think it was covered quite, maybe it was covered too obliquely. When I talk about smart grid and the need to figure out how utilities can make money on it, it's exactly as Dan said. Right now, the way the market works is a return on equity type market. And the way utilities make, the independently owned utilities make money, that method has developed over 100 years of administrative legislative precedence at both the National Energy Reliability Commission and the Florida Commission.
Utilities.
So the way of utilities making profits is developed as a precedent over many, many years. And as Barry just said, you're not going to change that overnight. And if Florida even tried to change it outside a construct of the Fed's doing it, it's probably not going to work. But to get demand-side management, and Dan's exactly right, why would a utility say, I'm going to invest in control and information so that my customers can quit buying less from me? Okay? We have to figure out how they can make money on the customer making less. Some people like decoupling. I'm not a big favor of it because I'm an academic. I like to see systems that have worked and I can verify that we understand exactly what we're doing.
And is there another way for the utilities to make money off helping people be more efficient other than decoupling?
We don't know what the technologies are going to be yet. So it's really hard to actuarialize what the profit potential is of certain technologies when we're still developing. I mean, we spent $50 million on the Florida Energy System Consortium to develop alternative energy and control, smart grid technologies. Some of them are out there. It's an interesting dynamic. 15 years ago in the smart grid world, we thought we were building microgrids with a lot of automation that was going to let alternative energy come in, solar and wind and everything get in. And we're doing really smart control things. Now, how many people think that those control things have enabled operations or the engineering departments of the utilities? No. You know where those things have ended up? The chief information officers. The person who controls the smart grid for JEA is Wyonyi. She's the chief information officer. It's actually ended up being the utilities seeing that smart grid is actually a business case. And those who have been developing the technologies, we didn't even get it. We've been building these things and we didn't even know what the heck we were building. And now that we're going back and looking at where our technologies ended up, they're being used by the management of the utilities, not by the people who operate. And so we're seeing that dynamic develop over time. And we're seeing that the real argument for smart grid is not engineering efficiency, although that's the long-term outcome. The real near-term thing is utilities are starting to see some of what we developed is actually increasing their helping their bottom line. But it's helping it in the business case, the chief information officers, the billing. It's no surprise to me that the first technology that's really hit it big is not the one that we hyped up a lot as engineering scientists. It's the smart meter, okay? The smart meter has nothing to do with operating the grid. There is no feedback mechanism from the information of your smart grid to the automation of your feeder, okay? All that information flows into your CIO, who then puts it into the billing people. The billing people then provide you as an add-on to your rate. In some places, sometimes they do it for free, a snapshot of how you're using your energy. And hopefully that makes you a better customer, okay? They really hope it's gonna make you a better customer. We need to make sure it makes you a better customer so that the trend continues, because what will happen is if we invest millions and millions of dollars in smart grid and it's a failure, we're not coming back to the table with utilities, okay? We're just not gonna come back to the table. They only get 8% on equity. All right, now they get a guaranteed market, which means they can save up a lot of money, as Dan said, but they don't get a high return. You wouldn't go into business for what they get. And they only stay in business because they've been in it for 100 years and nobody else can get in to compete with it.
Barry?
I've got two things, both unrelated to each other. Only on 17th, I think as part of your question is how do you get municipals to engage more? But I mean, that was sort of a passing thought or phrase in your question. And interesting example, in Orlando, Orlando Utilities Commission really wasn't that progressive, I thought, from investing in demand-side management, energy efficiency, and renewable energy. And then the utility director, the Orlando Utilities is a separate governing body from the city. The city owns it, but they have their own separate appointed governing members. And the utility director went before the city just to give an update, annual update.
Yes, next.
Orlando Utilities. And he gave a fine presentation, and one of the slides happened to be about energy efficiency and their efforts in renewable energy as well. And the city council in Orlando got stuck on that slide, and they kind of quizzed him more and more about, well, how much are you investing, and what would happen if we did more, and what would be the impact on rates? And he didn't have a lot of the answers, but he remembered getting stuck on that slide. And he went back to his staff afterwards, and they reorganized as a result of being stuck on a slide for 20 minutes, appointed somebody who used to be in charge of generation to now be in charge of sustainability, gave him a department and said, get us going in this area because they want it, and it seems, as I described, this is the whole, show us that it makes sense. The point I want to make there is that it actually has an impact, whether it's a municipal utility or an investor-owned utility, when people engage in the debate and go and have rational discussions with their local elected officials and statewide elected officials and just say, this is a good idea, here's why economically it makes sense, and not the Statue of Liberty is going to get covered with water, but this is a good economic argument. Let's try to move in that direction, local elected official or state elected official. The second thing I want to say, and since I'm the utility guy and you all came here for some fireworks, what the heck? I think that environmental groups are really, really good at talking about macro effects of the impact of moving in one direction or another, or not moving in one direction or another. And that movie we saw at the beginning is a great example. You saw sort of the macro stuff of if we do this or we don't do this. they're really, really, really bad at talking about the micro impacts. And when the idea here, and this is a very wide-ranging public discussion, so I don't expect to go into the details of decoupling, which is kind of a complex economic principle. But, I mean, we could all talk about it for hours, but I want to bore you to death with it. The point is that it's a theory that can make sense, done the right way. The investor utilities in Florida, it doesn't really affect the municipal utilities in Florida because we're already decoupled. And again, I don't want to go into the details, but the investor utilities feel as though it doesn't make sense for them. And there used to be I don't know, a commercial like, this is your brain and then this is your brain on drugs or something like that. What we need to see is, here is your utility and here is your utility with decoupling. Investor-owned utilities need to see at a very micro level what their operation would look like. If Dan says, hey, you can make just as much money with decoupling or more money or whatever, the incentives are better to move you in the right direction. Well, there needs to be not a generic analysis of what it looks like for a generic utility, but a specific analysis for what it looks like for the specific utility that you are trying to convince. And that's what I do in taking the Gainesville model and showing it to my other members. And I say, look, if you've got customers with high bill complaints, all you got to do is help them lower their bills, and they'll love you. So, and this is how Gainesville did it. That's not me, is it? Okay. This is how Gainesville did it. This is how you can do it. This is the investments they made. These are the investments you need to make. And the same needs to be true with those groups that want to move in that direction, is say, this is how life would look like from a regulatory perspective and a profit perspective if you did this to your specific utility.
Dale, go ahead.
Susan, just a quick, you threw out the word capitalism, which gets me all excited, and I'm ready to go on that one. I don't know that we have time or interest. I'm at a disadvantage. I don't know what I'm specifically reacting to, but you did toss me a softball, and that I would be remiss if I didn't conclude that while the foundation is particularly interested in the broadest possible conversation happening, I want to make it clear that we're unabashedly, unashamedly free enterprise oriented. And so the defense of or the articulation of capitalism's role in the process is one that we can and should have. No system, no economic system has created the amount of wealth that our system has. So don't know what I'm reacting to, but if anybody's watching and leaves with, okay, the foundation guy just watched a softball pitch go right by and didn't even swing, let me at least take a swing and hit that. And if anybody wants to talk about that afterwards, we'll go to Starbucks together and we can do that.
But then I have to throw back the other softball, which is we don't have a free market around energy at all. So it is funny in the political context in which we operate, right? We have, so it is very funny when people throw out the free market and the capitalism, but it doesn't really relate to our energy system, particularly in investor-owned utility areas.
Well, whether you have a system that exists as free enterprise by the cover on the book or not, versus the principles that the free enterprise is quite complicated, and and it boils down into your view of human action and those types of things. So this goes back to my interest in push versus pull, buy-in versus authoritarian or compliance, those types of issues play at the fundamental behaviors that you have to recognize fall into a free enterprise system. So I think we're talking about whether we're classifying and say, does it exist or doesn't? A binary question is entirely different than should we ignore the fundamental principles that support free enterprise and ignore them as they don't exist when we're trying to fix our energy problems.
And I think the question really also was relating to the kinds of decisions where we put the pursuit of money above public health, and that was really the...
Okay. I knew we might go here. I don't want to spar with you on those issues.
That's all right. We don't want to...
Because I'll have to step out of my role of a foundation and then just be an unabashed... Well, anyway, we'll chat. We'll chat. But this is the dialogue that we have to have. This is absolutely the dialogue we have to have. And the forums of... But what I hesitate to is if it turns into who gets applause for the one-liner versus who didn't get the applause, we don't get anywhere.
Well, yeah,
we don't get anywhere.
Dave, you wanted to make a comment, and then Dan.
Just really short, because I think I'm coming across as a free marketeer here. In actuality, free markets suck, but they don't suck as much as everything else. Okay? And that's why we need an opportunity fund. There are inefficiencies in the market. And we need money to put investments in where the public thinks the investment needs to go in and not necessarily where businesses do. And that's all I want to say.
Dan?
Yeah, and I would just add, I think we start getting in trouble when we debate whether the word free in the market, right? Because as, we've been sort of debating back and forth, is it really a free market in energy? Of course, it's not a pure
I want to know
thing,
more
it's
about
not binary, as you said, which I agree with. So I think, clearly we have a market-based system that has generated a huge amount of wealth and prosperity, and the issue is creating the right incentives so that the market is not only creating wealth, but creating prosperity for the long run. And that's where things like public health standards come in. That doesn't mean people don't make money. It just means that you have to account for the fact that in the process of making money, if you're also making people sick, that's probably not a good thing. So, we have 40 years of success with the Clean Air Act, and it's made capitalism stronger, even though some folks have, throughout that period, objected to those standards. I think the reality is we'd be choking on our own fumes, and there would be much more fundamental challenges than we have right now. So it's, in my view, is a question of getting the incentives right so the markets are working for you, and not a question of whether we're going to have markets or not, because we are.
Can someone, people, so can someone take a stab at, we have a question from Thomas Epps, who's watching online at home, about battery storage, so vanadium redox batteries and load leveling, and how that's going to work with the integration of distributed solar systems. I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab. He's also asking about feed-in tariffs, as Gainesville has done. Gainesville's done a number of things they have a feed-in tariff program. They have just are starting on building a biomass plant, and they have been a leader also in energy efficiency. So you've referred to Gainesville, but there's a couple different things happening in Gainesville that are worth note. So did you want to talk about, Barry, did you want to talk about the Gainesville feed-in tariffs, or Dave? Okay, batteries first.
Okay. Energy storage is crucial to the state of Florida. We don't have, we're elevation challenged. We can't store with hydro. We are going to need batteries. And right now we have battery technology that works for rooftop solar. The price of battery is about $1,600 per kilowatt hour. So very quickly you can scale that to generation scale, and you can see that it would be extra. We can't afford energy storage now. Whether there's going to be a breakthrough, we're waiting for the Einstein moment to happen. So how long do you wait for the Einstein moment? Do you plan for the Einstein moment? I don't know. I think we need a policy that's independent of energy storage at this time, and let's all go to kneel down before we go to bed at night and pray that the Einstein moment happens, because it's going to be essential within the next 100 years. But near term, we need to be investing our research efforts heavily. We're probably the most dependent on energy storage here in this state. It would be nice that when the Einstein moment happens, we build it in this state, we manufacture it in the state, and we export it from this state. But at the current time, it's probably not a solution for our grid problems. No, I'm just talking about lithium-ion batteries right now. That's the only thing we have that's working.
I'm going to switch gears and talk about the feed-in tariff, which is kind of a strange name for overpaying for solar energy. Now, I don't. Well, you know what? That was a bad way to say it.
Environment and our energy.
Because that's not even the point I want to make. Well, I installed that 5 kilowatt solar system on my house, and the state, out of the $30,000 that it cost, the state's paying me $19,000. I mean, that's a huge rebate. Number one, I would have done it for a lot less money, but thank you for putting it out there. Number one. Number two is they paid it to me at the start. If I shut that thing down or sell it, I've made a lot of money. So the incentive is at the beginning and not over time. The feed-in tariff, the concept of the feed-in tariff is that you don't get anything for installing it up front, but rather than get the one-for-one trade-off of you replace a kilowatt hour, so essentially you're reducing. It looks like energy conservation. You're reducing your consumption. You get paid So for every kilowatt hour, the price is 12 cents today in Gainesville. What they did is they took that incentive, that they decided on an incentive they wanted to give, like per unit, and they said, well, over the life of the system, let's pay 32 cents a kilowatt hour. That's what they started with, 32 cents a kilowatt. Remember, today is 12. We're going to pay you 32 cents a kilowatt hour for everything that your solar energy system produces. Hey, that's a pretty good incentive to keep the thing running, clean and running. And if it breaks, fix it fast, because I'm losing some money in this free market enterprise here. Gainesville admits that they overpaid on that 32 cents kilowatt hour. They wanted to get the market going. They're knocking that down, that price down.
Go away for one more minute.
To 26, maybe even a little bit lower over time. But essentially what they did is they said, if we took this money up front, how do we incent people to keep their photovoltaic systems running over a long period of time? We have a couple other municipal electric utilities that are looking at the idea of their feed-in tariff of maybe in the range of, instead of 32 cents, maybe 15 or 18 cents kilowatt hour. Now remember, they're paying for that solar system for the life of that system, really over 20 years. That's really where the incentive should be over the long time, the long-term production of the feed-in tariff. I'm not sure how investor owns go about doing that. They first have to identify a rebate that they want to give, but personally, I think that the feed-in tariff is the absolute best way to give an incentive to photovoltaic energy systems.
So we're going to do a real quick, let each one of you make a kind of a wrap-up comment. And Trish has asked, I think, the question of the day and perhaps the question of this series. And then Senator Jones and Representative Long are going to wrap up and talk to you about the next steps in this regard, which is how do we attract green technology here to Florida? She says we don't need more people in Florida. We need jobs for the people who are here. We need a long-term plan for the economy, the environment, and our energy policy to be renewable, low cost, and non-toxic. So I couldn't have said it better myself, Tricia. So if we just, why don't we run through real quick and just keep it short, what you think we need to do in Florida to attract clean energy jobs here.
Okay, well, I'm not from Florida, so I'm not going to try to prescribe any details, but I think the basic message is you have to get the market to work for you by creating incentives to build it here and use it here. And there's a variety of ways of doing that. We at NRDC have worked with utilities in other states to establish decoupling systems that work so that energy efficiency is profitable. I think that's an important focus because while, I mean, we agree, solar right now is more expensive than generating with fossil fuels. Energy efficiency is cheaper. So start with that. That is the foundation of a clean energy system. And figure out a way so that the market works. It could be feed-in tariffs. It could be a renewable electricity standard, which requires a certain fraction that's realistic, that grows over time, that doesn't necessarily pay a fixed amount. You let the market decide how much, what the cheapest one is to bring in. So there's different ways of doing it, different models, and when you look at technologies, different technologies need different things at different stages in their cycle. Let me close with this. If you think about what we need to get into clean energy technologies, there's a cost curve. There's very low cost things, energy efficiency, which is actually saving money. There's some things sort of in the middle of the cost curve where they're a little bit more expensive than the alternative technologies, and then there's the high end of the cost curve, which is advanced technology that's not really ready for market. So you need a policy that's actually tailored to each of those segments. On the low end, where it's energy efficiency, it's a question about breaking down the barriers and making cost-effective things profitable to do. That can be building codes to require better buildings that implement cost-effective energy efficiency when a building is built, because it's a lot cheaper to build it right than to have to retrofit it later, and decoupling and those kinds of things. In the middle of the cost curve are things where pricing incentives really work. You're a little bit out of the market, so whether you're paying for a carbon price on fossil fuels or a renewable electricity standard that adds a little bit of extra value to producing the cleaner power relative to the dirty power, that can bring that in. And then on the high end of the curve, that's where we really need the research and development to bring those costs down and get them closer to market. So that's the kind of strategy that I think we need to think through.
Okay. Any other comments on that? And we're notorious for staying on time, so we'll have to make it quick.
Okay. I will, and since Dale's got us in the mood to sing, I'm going to, a song lyric just came to mind. You guys can help me out. I don't remember the name of the song or the artist, but the one phrase said, "Too many people and not enough eyes to see." Okay? And that's so crucial, starting with the amount of public activism. Policy starts with people engaging with their politicians and saying, "You're not going to get reelected unless you do what I want." Okay? We don't teach science and math good enough in our schools. So when people grow up and become electors, they can't understand the issues that are behind them. We don't invest in our university research, so we don't have enough scientists out here looking into the future and giving us the stuff we need. And for some reason, the industries that we bring to Florida don't have R&D departments. They're not looking into our future either. Too many people, not enough eyes to see. That's where we need to focus.
Barry?
Even though I sort of railed against using platitudes all morning long, what the heck, I'll use a platitude. Imagine where we'd be if today, if 20 or 30 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when we had the Arab oil embargoes, if we said then, let's move away from being so dependent on Middle Eastern oil. And we'd be in a lot better place if we had made more significant headway or consistent significant headway. So I'm a big believer in saving for retirement and Christmas accounts and so on and so forth. And I believe that, and I'm not going to say it just because I want to reiterate 25 cents, because that may or may not be the right policy, but I believe in reasonable, modest investments over time will move us in the right direction. So I don't believe that we need to jump off a cliff, but I do believe we need to make a dedicated, significant, or modest investment, and we'll be surprised 5 years from now and 10 years from now, or maybe 30 years from now, where we end up. We don't know where it's going to be, but we know it's going to be a better, cleaner, more self-reliant place.
And Dale, you get the last word.
4 sentences, and this will be self-serving because I do want to iterate and underscore why the 6 pillars mean so much to us, is acknowledge the interconnectedness of an economy, and that when we talk about the energy policy falls in one pillar that is linked to all the other pillars. So you talk about quality of life. So there's overlap. Those are not exclusive categories. So when we talk about things that we do in energy policy, look for those known and anticipated consequences and the unintended consequences. And I think, and then the conversation. Pleased to be part of it. We're just getting started, and we've got to continue it.
Okay, very good. Thank you to the panelists.
We had many questions we couldn't answer, and we're going to try to get you those answers after this panel. But one, I think, is a great question to introduce our last 2 speakers. Just going to speak for a couple of minutes. Travis writes, now that federal action on climate and energy appears stalled, how does that affect energy policy in Florida? And can it present an opportunity for our state to assume a national leadership role? And so Senator Dennis Jones and Representative Janet Long, who've been instrumental in bringing us this panel, have some exciting news on where the momentum for this series is taking us next.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to let the question be answered by my colleague here, Representative Long, because she'd already prepared some comments in that area. But I'd like to start, first of all, by thanking Dr. Bill Law, our current president, Dr. Tom Furlong, our previous president, for allowing Representative Long and I to, not only allowing us, but encouraging us to move forward with these first 3 public policy forums. They have certainly been successful, and that's because of the participation of the audience. So I want to thank you as well. And as we move forward, I would like to also say that Dr. Oliver touched on this as well, that the St. Pete College Board of Trustees, as well as Dr. Law, are adopting a policy in the very near future for St. Pete College to actually have an Institute of Strategic Policy Solutions, which will be another great asset to St. Petersburg College. And I almost forgot to thank Dr. Oliver for hosting here on the Seminole campuses in this beautiful digitorium all three of our presentations and our forums. Our focus for the future now would be to take the information from these first three forums and move them to a little higher level at the collaborative labs. And to do that, has been mentioned by the panel here, and actually try and create a policy that would be something that possibly could be receptive by the Florida legislature. So that will be the next step that we'll be taking. We'll be inviting several of these participants as well as others to participate. Representative Long might want to elaborate on that a little bit, but we truly want to make this institute a resource that can be available not only to the public, but an academic path for students for degrees in the area of public administration, and be something this community can be proud of for years to come. So my colleague, Representative Long.
Thank you. Well, my job right now is to wrap everything up and especially thank Dan Berard, who is a facilitator, Susan Glickman, our panelists, Dr. Dan Lashof, Dr. David Cardis, Barry Moline, and Dr. Dale Brill. I think you did an incredibly stupendous job and left us all, I'm sure, with so many questions. It's very mind-boggling. I also want to extend a very special thanks to the college and to all of you for giving up your Saturday morning to come and listen to this really critical issue, so critical to our state and our nation. And we wouldn't be able to put this on without the generosity of Bright House, the St. Pete Times, Progress Energy, the Trade Winds, and the Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association. What a great gift they have given to all of you with a certificate that you can go out and enjoy the beautiful trade winds and the beautiful beaches. As you all have heard, Senator Jones and I, as well as other members of the legislature, will be working very hard in the coming months to craft legislation that emerges from the collaborative lab experience that we hope to have in early November, that will put Florida in a leadership place nationwide with our energy policy. It is a well-documented fact that strong economies depend on the profitable energy systems and utility and power generation systems. A manufacturer, for example, requires highly reliable and high-quality energy power in order to operate. This gives us enormous opportunity for new and sustainable jobs right here in Florida. Alternative energies will also provide enormous opportunities for new jobs. And as you've heard, and it's been clearly demonstrated, the struggle is, how do we get there? Well, let me just share with you. China and Korea are way ahead of us in terms of the investment that they are making in new energy. Their economies are thriving, and they are pulling essential resources away from the United States. It is critical that we have your input as we move forward. We know the solutions are not going to be easy, and that it's going to be a real struggle within the legislative body. But I think you've heard today that this is absolutely something that we have got to do for our kids, for our grandkids, and the future of this beautiful state. As Dr. Brill so eloquently quoted, we only pass this way once, and we will not be here again. So I thank you for coming. I hope you'll stay tuned. And don't go away for one more minute, because Dr. Oliver has one more comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Jones, Representative Long, and all the members who joined us. And thank you all for being here this morning. At the risk of sounding like an OxyClean pitchman, but wait, there's more. We do invite you, we appreciate you being on campus this morning, and we do invite you to end your visit to campus, if you'd like, with another treat. a brief visit to our new natural habitat park that opened just a month ago, which is right outside this building. Professor Kelly Stickrath. Kelly, where are you? Kelly is right there, over to my left. She is the lead professor of our environmental science technology program on campus. She'll be waiting out in the lobby right at the registration desk, maybe about 10 minutes from now, Kelly, in case there's some folks that have questions for the panel. If any of you would like to take a brief 15-minute walk out to see our new natural habitat park and enjoy nature out on our boardwalk. And with that, though, we thank everyone again for joining us, and we are adjourned. Thank you.